the Marshal of the North. Geos 1. Summary. In the winter of 299, at the height of the War of the Five Kings, a young, 18-year-old bastard-born general took command of a ragged, demoralized army on the central north. It was his first command, and many expected him to fail. Instead, in just 1 month, he won his first brilliant campaign with astonishing self-confidence, boldness, and energy. He led his army to victory after victory, transforming the war in Westeros, winning praise from a grateful kingdom, and forging a legend. This is the story of Jon Snow's first campaign, and the dawn of a new age. Notes. Disclaimer: obviously I'm not owner of any of the characters, show or books. I don't take credit nor profit from doing this only for fun. The fanfiction is effectively an or, but don't expect things to be very different from canon, at least at the very beginning. Chapter 1, The White Wolf, The Battle of Tumbleown. Summary. Is strange that while the Riverlands seethed with the rebellion, Jon Snow's story began at home, in Winterfell, with the north besieged on all sides. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 298 After Aegon's conquest. War seems inevitable. Lady Catelyn Tully Stark's arrest of Lord Tyrion Lannister sparked a crisis between the Riverlands and the Westerlands. The questions over the legitimacy of King Joffrey's right to the throne and the political games of the capital resulted in Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, being imprisoned by the Lannisters. As the continent's powerhouses mobilize their armies, peace hangs by a thread. And as Westeros is plunged into another conflict over a succession dispute, a new generation of leaders is ready to clash with the old guard. With the detention of Lord Eddard's eldest daughter, Sansa, and the demand to recognize her lord as a traitor, the North, led by Robb Stark, officially rebels against what they call an act of tyranny, followed by the Riverlands, which were already in crisis with the Lannisters. At first, it seemed these two rebellious kingdoms would be quickly forced to surrender to the war machinery of the Lannisters and the Crown Lands. Yet, through patriotic fervor and bold tactics, the North incredibly resits. Riverrun Campaign. 30,000 Lannisters versus 6,000 Starks. Decisive victory for the North. At the end of 298, the North scores another critical victory at Oxcross, while the Reach and the Stormlands declare war on the Iron Throne. But the North still faces a powerful coalition of adversaries on two fronts. In the Riverlands, they battle the armies of the Crown Lands and the Westerlands. At home, the North faces a surprise invasion by the Greyjoys. In the capital, King's Landing, Lord Eddard Stark is executed, decapitated at the mere whim of an adolescent king. Peace is now a dream in Westeros. A dream that the continent would not know for years. The North is now under the command of Lord Robb Stark, the young wolf, who quickly earns a reputation as an excellent strategist through his significant victories on the battlefield. However, in the year 299, Robb and the Northern hierarchy planned a major military offensive to eliminate the power center of their greatest enemy, the Lannisters, and to regain control of the war initiative. The main effort is to be carried out by the Northern Army along the Gold Road under the command of Robb Stark himself. A second effort, led by Roose Bolton in command of the so-called Trident Army, is to keep Tywin Lannister's Crown Land Army at bay. A third, smaller effort is set for the western coast of the North against the Greyjoy advances. It aims to expel them from the western North and reopen communication routes by reclaiming Moat Cailin. The Northern Army in Winterfell is a poor cousin, deprived of the best armor and swords, stripped of troops to reinforce the North's forces in the Riverlands, and demoralized after suffering a series of defeats at the hands of the Ironborn. But the army's luck is about to change. On the second day of the first moon of 299, Robb Stark appoints a new commander to lead the army, his half-brother, Jon Snow. Snow arrives at the local army headquarters in Winterfell on the 28th of the first moon. He is just 18. 2 years have passed since he left his father's fortress. Since then, his luck has been mixed, a brief period as a novice at the wall, 10 days in the ice cells after finding himself on the wrong side of Sir Alistair Thorne. Jon later refuses to take his oath at the wall due to the injustice and hostility of the Black brothers toward him, leading him to roam with his new friend, Samwell Tarly, on a journey beyond the wall. Then a letter comes for him from his brother Robb. His father had been illegally imprisoned, and his sisters Sansa and Arya had been taken hostage by the Lannisters. Robb orders Jon to go to Winterfell and help his brother Bran keep the North functioning. His friend Samwell follows him from Castle Black, having also decided not to take the Black, volunteering to help him in his mission. On their way, they learn of the Greyjoy invasion and rush to Winterfell to warn Bran. But Jon and Sam arrive days late. Sir Roderick Castle's forces have already left the city. With the possibility of an attack, while the castle is unprotected, Bran decides to organize the few remaining squires and soldiers into a garrison. Jon, being the most experienced fighter, is appointed by Bran as the provisional commander of the garrison. Then comes a critical development. On the night of the 14th of the third moon, 299, Winterfell. A group of Ironborn led by the former Stark ward and now traitor, Theon Greyjoy, attempts to take the castle by night. Jon is alerted by the sounds and, thanks to luck, raises the alarm upon seeing the Ironborn climbing the staircase. But the enemy is already climbing the stairs of the family wing, and the guards are not in position. With virtually no armor and as the only one able to defend his younger siblings, Jon decides to confront the invaders and buy time for the rest of the garrison to wake up. With consummate skill, Jon proceeds to kill 6 of the 20 invaders on the narrow staircase, driving them into retreat. With adrenaline at its peak, shouting orders left and right, he organizes the few men-at-arms remaining in Winterfell and prepares to hunt down the Ironborn. With brutal efficiency, the 20 invaders are killed or captured within an hour. Jon even manages to defeat and capture the traitor, Theon, alive in single combat. In the morning, Bran and the rest of the castle openly acclaim him as the savior of Winterfell. When the news reaches his campaign headquarters, a grateful Robb legitimizes Jon. However, open resistance of the Robb's mother, Lady Catelyn, and the southern nobles forces the Lord of Winterfell to compromise in order to approve the legitimization of his half-brother. The agreement reached is that Jon will gain the last name but he will not given the title of prince, neither his bastard status would be removed, making him effectively a bastard with the last name Stark. Obviously this doesn't makes Jon fully happy, but at least he has fulfilled his infancy dream, gain the last name of his father, so he doesn't complain, neither really cares about the denial of royal titles and believes that sooner or later his brother will give him full rights. As compensation, Robb names him the leader of the armies in the north and promised to give Jon full rights and titles as soon as possible. Along with this important promotion, Jon is entrusted with the mission of expelling the Ironborn from the western coast and reclaiming Moat Cailin to reopen communication routes between Robb's army and the north. Several nobles have more right to command than Jon. Sir Roderick Castle, a professional soldier who first saw action in the Ninepenny Kings nearly 40 years ago. Leopold Tallheart, the Castellan of Torrens Square, is described as a competent and experienced commander. And Cleisewin, Lord of Sewin Castle, a young northerner committed to the cause and a staunch defender of the Starks. For the moment, these nobles see Jon as a misguided and unqualified young man, a political appointment, not as reliable as his brother simply due to his status as a bastard. They view him as someone who spends his time analyzing books and talking with his overweight friend Tarly instead of acting like a traditional commander. But there is something about Jon. As Sir Roderick will later say, his status as a bastard and the fact that he was not a man of many words did not work in his favor, but as soon as he stood in the command tent and began giving orders, he looked like Lord Stark himself. Jon impresses everyone with his tireless energy, compassion, and understanding of his men, often going to talk to the common soldiers about their problems and needs. Moira will later remark on her memories of those early days. In the evenings, Jon listened to the stories of his men, their tales of family lost to the Ironborn, of homes burned, and kin imprisoned. He did not command from a distance, he walked among them, their burdens becoming his own. After listening and inspecting general concerns and studying the situation reports, Jon gets to work. The new general imposes discipline and introduces reforms in nearly every area of the organization. In this task, he is supported by Bran Stark and Moira Reed, the latter becoming his personal field assistant for the rest of the campaign against the Ironborn. However, his most valuable aide is his logistics chief and second-in-command, Samwell Tarly, who, despite being a poor swordsman and quite overweight, will prove to be a genius in logistical areas. Tarly helps reorganize the North's road and supply systems while scouring the east and central north for men, transport, and food. The Northern Army's situation begins to improve, but Jon knows what will truly revitalize his demoralized army: victory in battle and the promise of vengeance against the invaders. Northern soldiers, I promise to lead you to the same glory your brothers in the Riverlands have achieved. I swear before the ancient gods of the north, we will not rest until every Ironborn invader is killed or in chains. Jon Snow, in his first proclamation to the army. Jon has spent almost his entire life studying the military and political history of the North and Westeros. Thanks to this prior knowledge, he has developed clear plans on how the campaign should be fought. Now he will put them into action. Jon, with 5,500 men, outnumbers the three main sections of the invaders, Asher, with 3,000, Aaron, with 3,500, and Victorian, with 5,000. But if the Ironborn manages to unite, he will be outnumbered. He must avoid this at all costs. His plan has all the characteristics of what will later be known as the art of Jonian warfare, a rapid and daring advance not against the expected targets, Moat Cailin and Victorian, but against the village of Crofter and Asher's forces, who have been left dangerously isolated. There he will occupy the only direct land route between Asher's forces in the Wolfswood and Aaron's in Stony Shore, separating them and allowing him to deal with them individually. The goal of the campaign is not simply to expel the Ironborn but to destroy their capacity to launch any potential future invasion of the North. Jon knows that when they feel threatened, the Ironborn will retreat to their ships, so it is vital to encircle and annihilate the enemy in the open field or, failing that, to pursue them relentlessly. Jon's plan is aided by the nature and culture of the Ironborn. Due to their idea of the Iron Price, they are authentic glory hounds, which makes them a force lacking cohesion, and their lack of discipline in land battles is well known. To add to their flaws, the Ironborn's march capabilities are abysmally inferior to those of the North, allowing Jon's plans to come to fruition. On the 5th day of the 4th moon, Jon moves his headquarters to the Tumbledown Tower in preparation for his offensive against Asher's forces in Deepwood Motte. Ironically, it is Asher who attacks first on the 11th. The Greyjoy troops take Croftus village, and, with their morale shattered, the northern garrison retreats to Winterfell without putting up any resistance. Unbeknownst to the northerners, Asher is determined to find Theon's scouting parties. Her fixation is such that she rejects Aaron's plan of close cooperation between their forces in advancing on Winterfell and abandons the Glover stronghold. Her forces remain scattered throughout the Wolfswood, searching for any unlucky soul left in the forest, while Aaron continues with his plan to advance through Torrens Square. But Asher's obsession with finding Theon is playing into Jon's hands. Croftus village is located in the eastern parts of the Wolfswood, and its proximity to Jon's lines leaves Asher in an uncomfortable position, only a half-day's march from Jon's headquarters, entirely unaware that the northern army is in front of them. Jon sees an opportunity to lure Asher into a trap. The wooded terrain means that Asher can only march back to Deepwood Motte along a narrow path, and, moreover, Asher plans to seize Tumbledown Tower in preparation for a possible advance on Winterfell. Thus, on the 15th, Jon springs the trap and baits the Princess of the Iron Islands. Jon's deception begins by showing his men, making Asher believe that only 1,000 northerners stand before her. Driven by arrogance and overconfidence from the ease of her campaign so far, Greyjoy decides to give battle. The northerners have positioned themselves behind a small river, only 6 paces wide and 2 deep, just a mile from Tumbledown Castle. Jon does not expect his line to hold, in fact, he counts on the line slowly retreating, tiring the Ironborn and inflicting casualties on the enemy in the process, prompting Asher to send in her reserves when she senses victory is within reach. It is then that the northern cavalry and infantry, hidden in the woods flanking the road, will emerge, surrounding and, with any luck, destroying the Ironborn army before they realize what is happening. Confident of victory, Asher orders an attack. The initial Ironborn assault is absorbed by the northern infantry, who easily hold the line against their enemies' disorganized attacks. After an hour of fighting, the northern line begins to fall back slowly and orderly towards the village and Tumbledown Castle, with the Ironborn hot on their heels. The northern losses have been fewer than 75 soldiers, while the enemy army has already lost over 400 men by the time the line stabilizes on the town's outskirts. The combat stalls for another hour, with the northerners beginning to push the Ironborn back. The northern plan is going well, and the arrival of 700 reinforcements led by Sir Roderick allows the northerners to continue bleeding the enemy. The Ironborn leader has 2 options, to send in her reserves or cut her losses and abandon the bulk of her infantry. The generals have made their bets, and it is Asher who loses patience and breaks first. With a series of shouts and war horns, Asher and her last reserves enter the fray. The fate of the Ironborn soldiers is now sealed. The Northerners halt their advance and await the charge of the enemy's reserves. Meanwhile, a fire is lit from the tower at Tumbledown Castle. Suddenly, 500 riders charge from behind while nearly 2,000 furious Northerners attack the flanks. Assaulted on all sides and with the threat of being surrounded and massacred, the Ironborn's cohesion collapses completely. The final straw is Asher's capture by Jon himself. In single combat, the Northern general manages to disarm Greyjoy and knock her unconscious. The remaining Ironborn scatter, many of them try to escape. Dozens perish in the ensuing pursuit, while hundreds are taken prisoner by the Northerners. Only a small group of low-ranking nobles and a handful of men manage to escape, fleeing towards Aeron's forces, which have finally managed to take Witford Fort to pursue his niece. Battle of Tumbledown. Casualty estimate. Stark. 200. Greyjoy. 2,600. The Stark army departs immediately, attempting to catch Aeron off guard. However, poor weather and his men's exhaustion make a rapid advance toward Aeron impossible. The Ironborn leader, realizing the Northerners have assembled a large army and now threaten to outflank him as they march toward Torrens Square in aid of Dagmar Redbeard's siege force, decides to abandon his plan and march to the coast. The Ironborn have had enough. The garrison at Deepwood Motte and Dagmar's forces must be sacrificed. Victorion's army and the fortress of Moat Cailin will become their new refuge. It had to be a bloody bastard, both literally and figuratively. Lady Glover on the liberation of Deepwood Motte. 3 days later, Jon retakes Deepwood Motte without opposition. He and his men are greeted by the cheers of the North's common folk, though the local nobles, the Glovers, are somewhat divided on how they feel about having to thank a bastard. After the Battle of Tumbledown, the soldiers and common people have a new nickname for their general, the White Wolf, named for his steadfast companion, the albino direwolf ghost. It is a term of affection and reverence because it inspires the common folk to believe that victory in the war is still possible. In just one moon, Jon has transformed a decimated, ragged, and demoralized army into an entity driven by esprit de corps, eager for more victories. In his first campaign, he has shown himself capable of the same brilliance as his half-brother, and now king in the north, Robb Stark. But above all, it is his leadership skills, his energy, and his boundless empathy for his soldiers that have captivated the Northerners. These are the qualities that inspire the common folk to keep going for the North, for the Starks and for the man they will one day proudly proclaim as their protector. Notes. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I know that is not the traditional writing style, so please tell me what do you think. This is my first work, also English is not my main language. So, if you see any mistake please tell me. If you have any constructive criticism or comments feel free to put it in the comment section. Chapter 2, Squids on the Run, The Battle of Blackpool. Summary. The Northern general had claimed its first victory in battle. 1/3 of the enemy invasion force had been wiped out at Tumbledown. The Northern morale is slowly recovering after a series of defeats. But there is no time to rest. Jon's new enemy is a veteran of 2 wars. Someone who will not make the same mistakes as Asher did. Someone who will really test what type of material the Northerner is made of. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 5th Moon, 299. The War of the Five Kings has entered its 2nd year. And in what the South largely regards as a secondary front, a surprising development has taken place. A 19-year-old Northern general has led his army on a blitz campaign across the western north, defeating the main force of Asher Greyjoy and capturing the commander and Ironborn princess. He chased the remnants through the Wolfswood in a race towards the coast and Aeron's forces. Despite his best efforts, poor weather and the exhaustion of his troops prevented Jon from finishing off the survivors. With the weather turning rough and his troops weary after the battle, the Northern general halts his advance at Deepwood Motte, the ancestral home of the Glovers, to reflect and plan his strategy while his army takes a brief respite. Aiming to cut off the Second Ironborn army's retreat, the Northern general focuses on preventing Aeron from withdrawing to the coast and escaping southward by sea to join Victorion's forces. Time is of the essence. But despite his significant momentum, it isn't until the weather clears on the 20th that Jon and his men can begin their southward march. His objective isn't what Aeron and the Ironborn anticipate, Torrens Square, rather, it's to cut off the mountain passes of the Blue Hills. While Jon and the Northerners march towards Blackpool, the remnants of Asher's army reach Aaron's outpost at the northern lake of the Two Rills Lakes on the night of the 21st. They immediately inform the general of the Second Army of his niece's defeat and subsequent capture. Despite the imminent threat, Aaron and his council face a serious dilemma. Being at Witford Fort means they are halfway between the coast and Torrens Square. The march distance between Witford and Blacksword, the coastal village where the ships are anchored, is half the distance between Blacksword and Deepwood. However, the proximity to the coast and conflicting reports only serve to plunge Aaron's war council into further confusion. The news that nearly an entire force had been annihilated had struck terror into the Ironborn captains. They were well aware of the Northerners' martial prowess on land and feared how the North would react after weeks of Ironborn pillaging. But while the council debates and deliberates exhaustively, for Aaron, there are only two real options. If he chooses to march towards Dagmar, he would have to give up the plunder they had gathered and abandon the fleet anchored at Blacksword, committing to a land march of over 800 kilometers to Moat Cailin across the most dangerous terrain in the western north. But the alternative isn't better. Their other option is to pack up and dash to the coast to board the ships and escape south. This would mean sacrificing Dagmar's forces and abandoning the original plan Balon Greyjoy had devised with his two sons. Aaron presents the options to his council, but they fail to reach an agreement. The debate drags on throughout the night and nearly all the next day, wasting valuable hours as the Northerners are already on the move. But when a deadlock seems inevitable, something remarkable happens. At the hour of the wolf, Aaron receives an urgent report. His scouts claim that Stark's army has been sighted marching towards Grove's Fort. They report an engagement with the Northern vanguard and state that the Northerners managed to repel the attack, inflicting heavy casualties on the Ironborn. Doubt and deliberation are over. With no time to lose, Aaron decides to take what seems to be the only reasonable option. On the morning of the 23rd, the Ironborn general orders a retreat to the coast. At the same time, he sends orders to Dagmar to abandon the siege of Torrens Square and fall back to Witford. Once there, the Ironborn captain has orders to entrench and hold firm to delay the Starks as long as possible. By midday, believing that the Northern army is far from its destination, they begin to march normally. They intend to pass the fortress of Blackpool to reach the rocky coast of Blacksword and embark back to join Victorion's forces. Every moment is precious. The enemy and victory are within our reach. Jon Stark to Sir Roderick, 5th Moon 23, 299. But the Ironborn are operating with incorrect information. The scouting party has, in reality, clashed with Moira and the Northern rearguard. It is the reserve forces leaving the place after 200 cavalry reinforcements arrive. Jon is not heading for Grove's Fort, rather, he is leaving it. The destination, Blackpool Castle. Having learned from prisoners the landing point and Aaron's general plan, Jon sees an opportunity to trap and destroy the Second Greyjoy army. But the challenge he faces is immense, even with a 2-day lead and better marching discipline. Deepwood is 90 kilometers from Blackpool, while Aaron's Witford is only 52 kilometers away. Jon had counted on a 2-day lead over the Ironborn, but the bad weather had only allowed him to advance 20 kilometers by dawn on the 23rd. Aaron holds an 18-kilometer lead over Jon. Despite the proximity of the two armies, neither knows exactly where the other is. So much so that Aaron and his captains are confident that Stark is still far from their position. Their belief is further reinforced when their scouts again make contact with what they think is the Northern vanguard, 10 kilometers from Deepwood. Over the next 2 days, conditions worsen dramatically. With mud everywhere, both armies engage in a series of skirmishes east of the Grove Fort Blackpool Road as they continue to advance. Even in this situation, the North's advantage in discipline and training sees them advancing almost 23 kilometers per day, compared to the Ironborn's 18. Closing the distance between them to 8 kilometers. Then, at dawn on the 26th, Jon's scouts report that a group of Ironborn has begun to move toward their position through the Wolf's Wood. The report raises more questions than answers. The scouts are unsure if they have encountered the enemy vanguard or just a raiding party. To Jon, this report seems irrelevant. The Northerner assumes it is only a raiding group returning to the main camp and orders the march to continue as planned. But only 2 hours later, a second report arrives. Sir Leopold Tallheart's scouts report that the entire Ironborn force is moving towards Blackpool. Rest assured, General, that here is the whole pack of squid. They march with the haste of those fleeing the seven hells. They are running toward the coast so fast that they are leaving pack animals and supplies behind tall hard rights. Jon reacts immediately, sending Roderick with the bulk of the cavalry and light infantry on a forced march to Blackpool Castle. The general knows that if he can capture the castle and hold it until his army arrives, he will have successfully cut off the Ironborn's escape route. On the night of the 26th, after a long forced march of 18 hours, the exhausted northerners arrive on the outskirts of the village and Blackpool Castle. They find Blackpool with a small garrison of 100 men. On Sir Roderick's orders, the northern knights dismount and quietly approach the castle. As they draw close, they hear something unusual. Shouts, revelry, and singing. The Ironborn are celebrating. Sir Roderick quickly realizes that the enemy is unaware of their presence. It's a golden opportunity and a stroke of luck. The veteran of the Pike Siege orders a surprise assault on the fortress with the few forces he has left. Even with their accumulated exhaustion, the battle is highly one-sided. The drunken garrison is unable to form a cohesive line and is quickly overrun. The battle turns almost immediately into a massacre, one in which the entire garrison is cut down without mercy. But despite their success, Sir Roderick and his captains know that the real challenge is yet to come. Soldiers, nothing is lost as long as courage remains. Sir Roderick to his forces, 5th Moon 27, 299. The castle of Blackpool is situated on a hill overlooking the lower valley. It serves as the crossroads between the path from Witford Fort, the access to Groves Fort, and the beginning of the route to Blacksword. The castle is unique in that it has a double wall system, giving defenders a tactical advantage. It is also a key strategic position in the region, as well as the natural bottleneck of the Blue Hills. Since the mountain range flanking the roads forms a dangerous and treacherous route, the Ironborn will have to pass through Blackpool if they wish to escape safely. On the morning of the 27th, as the sun rises, Jon and his council are desperate to advance toward Blackpool to aid Sir Roderick's contingent. But then, scouts report an alarming event. The scouts report that a column of enemy soldiers is marching toward them. Believing it to be Dagmar's assault force of 800 soldiers coming to Aaron's aid, Jon is forced to halt and take defensive positions against the imminent attack. The general orders the units at his disposal, about 4,000 men, to form battle lines and await the assault. But after 3 hours, the attack never comes. Jon has been tricked by one of Dagmar's cavalry parties. There is no imminent threat on their flanks, and the so-called assault group turns out to be only a few light enemy riders who quickly retreat into the surrounding woods after a brief skirmish. It is one of Jon's few tactical mistakes. By the time he realizes the situation, it's too late. Jon has given the Ironborn a crucial 24 hours, an error that could prove very costly for the Northmen. On that same day, just 14 kilometers away, Aaron's vanguard is spotted on the outskirts of the village surrounding the castle, barely 800 meters from the walls. Paradoxically, the sight of the enemy isn't what worries the Northerners, it's the absence of any trace of Jon's main army that unsettles Sir Leopold and the bulk of the men. Despite the lack of news from his general, Sir Roderick, the northern commander, remains calm. The old knight meticulously prepares the defense. Drawing on his prior experience in fighting the Ironborn, the knight designs a clever strategy. He knows that the only way to survive is to buy enough time for Jon to arrive and relieve the besieged garrison. With limited infantry at his disposal, Roderick decides to fight with an aggressive hit-and-run tactic, using his cavalry to disrupt the attackers' organization and delay them as long as possible. Knowing that initiative is key to the initial phase of his plan, Sir Roderick begins with a bold cavalry charge against Aaron's vanguard, led by Lord Dunstan Drum. The cavalry charge is so formidable that the northern riders manage to push the enemy back to the surrounding high ground. On a hill, just over a mile from the castle walls, it seems the northerners will manage to break the weak Ironborn cohesion. But time has run out. The proximity to Witford Valley and the rest of the invading column means that Drum receives constant reinforcements as the rest of the Ironborn army begins to arrive. Having achieved his objective, with Ironborn tents and supplies set ablaze, and unwilling to incur unnecessary casualties, Sir Roderick orders the retreat. The elite northern cavalry manages to put enough distance between them and the Ironborn with a tactic worthy of Dornish tales. Castle has managed to buy time by repeatedly feinting charges, confusing the enemy, and covering the retreat toward the fortress so effectively that the Ironborn fail to pursue them. The initial clash has been a success for Sir Roderick's men. While Aeron and the majority of the Greyjoy army finally arrive, Castle's delay has cost the Ironborn nearly 6 hours. Aeron is aware that Stark's army is near, so despite the setting sun, he decides to launch a frontal assault on the castle. The Ironborn hopes to quickly seize the fortification and continue their escape toward the coast. However, Roderick's elite archers and dismounted knights manage to repel repeated frontal charges, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. The poor visibility in the darkness only compounds the attackers' confusion. And though there is a last-minute scare when some drowned men, fanatical religious followers under Aeron's command, manage to overtake a section of the wall, they receive no support and are soon slaughtered by the northern counterattack, which crushes Aeron's hopes of a quick resolution. For Sir Roderick and his men, the 27th has been a long day of heroic action against a vastly superior force. It is an act Jon will never forget. 7 years later, Jon will name Sir Roderick as Lord of the Stony Shores, and will always remember, and say to Roderick's critics, "He saved us that day." However, as night falls, Roderick's force is on the brink of collapse. "Our soldiers are exhausted from fatigue and have run out of supplies. If you don't send reinforcements, we will not be able to hold our ground," he writes in a desperate plea for help to Jon. While Jon marches at the head of 4,000 men, the Ironborn general must decide whether to stay and try to force his way to the coast or retreat to Witford Fort and join forces with Dagmar, who is marching back to his army, to then embark on the long journey to Moat Cailin by land. Aeron chooses to stay where he is. The Greyjoy is betting that he will be able to capture the fortress at dawn and dash toward the coast before Jon arrives with the rest of the northern army. Aeron also hopes to buy enough time for Dagmar to reach Witford and fortify himself, thus prolonging Jon's campaign on the Stony Shores. He is convinced that Stark won't be able to march on Moat Cailin with an enemy in his rear, especially one that has raided his lands on multiple occasions. His reasoning is sound, but his intelligence is outdated. And Aeron has severely underestimated the speed and efficiency of Jon's army. For 5 days, we have become wolves encircling our prey. We didn't want to give any clue or signal to the enemy until it was too late for the squids to react. Samwell Tarly to Brandon and Robb Stark, 28th of the 5th moon, 299. At dawn on the 28th, Aeron Greyjoy's army is situated 2 kilometers southeast of Blackpool. The Ironborn general has ordered his troops into 2 sections. The right flank is positioned at the base of the surrounding mountains, while the left flank ends at a small lake. The front line, led once more by Lord Drum, consists of 2,000 men. The forces are divided into 4 columns of 500 men each. With the previous day's defeat still fresh in his mind, the Ironborn captain has devised a plan to capture the fortress. Knowing that the gate from which the northerners have been emerging is the eastern one, Drum understands firsthand that it is the least covered yet most fortified section of the fortress. Thus, he expects the northern resistance to be strongest in that sector, and that any assault there would result in heavy casualties among his ranks. As a result, Dunstan has decided to carry out the initial attack on the northern side of the castle with 2 columns. Drum's plan is to divert the garrison's attention by pressuring it and forcing them to commit all their resources to that sector, allowing the 3rd and 4th columns to assault from the south when the northerners can no longer react. The second line, led by Aeron himself, is to remain vigilant and ready to engage wherever required. They are to face any arriving enemy reinforcements or, if necessary, join the assault. Drum's plan is sound and appears effective on paper. But when dawn breaks, only his 2 columns are ready to attack. Sir Roderick confronts Aeron with only 450 men, 100 dismounted knights, 200 elite cavalrymen, and the remainder of light archers or heavy crossbowmen. Although the Greyjoys have the numerical advantage, Sir Roderick remains calm. The old knight firmly believes that Jon's army will arrive to save him if they manage to buy enough time. To gain as much time as possible for Jon's arrival, Sir Roderick launches a bold plan. Before dawn, the northern cavalry emerges from the fortress and slowly approaches the Ironborn. Aware of the islanders' lack of tight formations, Castle hopes to disrupt any coordination among the enemy columns with harassing tactics. With the first light of morning, the northerners charge Drum's column. After the initial clash and before the second column can come to its aid, the northern horsemen withdraw back to their bastion, having killed 75 enemies without suffering any casualties. Sir Roderick also has a small ambush prepared. Castle expects that having been charged, the enemy soldiers will pursue them back to Blackpool, where they will be massacred by archers and crossbowmen. Drum's men take the bait, and his column pursues the northerners, while Baylor Blacktide's second column follows their comrades to an area right in front of the fortress gates where arrows and bolts rain death. Drum's column suffers 90 casualties before even touching the walls, while in conjunction with Baylor, the Ironborn suffer an additional 120 trying to reach them. The battle stalls for a few minutes before Aaron's men accept the futility of their attacks and retreat beyond the enemy projectile range. The battlefield falls silent for a couple of hours as both sides lick their wounds. When the sun reaches its peak, the Ironborn charge again with shields raised and ranks closed. Just as Sir Roderick is about to send his men to reinforce the northern side, the sound of battle cries alerts the northerners to the arrival of Alan Awkward's and Manfred Merlin's 3rd and 4th columns. The enemy's lack of discipline has ruined their commander's surprise, and, worse yet, has alerted Castle's soldiers to their position at just the right moment. Though they are able to scale the walls with relative ease, the lack of siege equipment means that assault ladders are their only way to reach the fortress walls. Exposed and having announced their presence prematurely, the Ironborn are quickly pushed back when Sir Roderick, in person, leads the reserves in a rapid response that retakes the section of the wall, with many enemy soldiers summarily executed. The northerners pushed back the invaders on all fronts, causing numerous casualties, but the numbers and, especially, the stamina of the northern garrison began to wane. Aaron is angry and frustrated with Drum's failure to dislodge a few bothersome northerners from that hilltop fortress. Knowing time is of the essence, the Ironborn sends all his reserves, save for his 200-man guard, to resolve the problem. He even sends a messenger to Drum with the order to charge immediately and break, once and for all, the North's determined defense. Dunstan is reluctant to do so. The columns have suffered nearly 600 casualties, and they lack siege weapons to breach or properly assault the walls. But Drum soon learns that Aaron's orders are unyielding. With the forces at his disposal, Drum orders his men to reform and advance slowly towards the wall. The Ironborn advance, expecting a hail of northern arrows as they enter the range. The fear is considerable, and the anticipation among soldiers and captains grows with every step they take. But the barrage never comes. Taking advantage of the enemy's need to regroup, the northern troops have retreated to the inner wall, unnoticed by the Ironborn. Sir Roderick intends to reduce the terrain his seasoned men must defend, creating a more manageable defense against a weary and downtrodden opponent who lacks siege weapons. The men of the 3rd and 4th columns scale the outer wall and open the northern gate, only to find that the northerners have retreated to the inner wall. A salvo of arrows and bolts warns the Ironborn that the direwolf's forces are still determined to resist. The Ironborn halt and reorganize. Fresh reserves, along with Awkward and Merlin's columns, are chosen to lead the assault, bringing with them a hastily assembled battering ram and assault ladders to attack the gate, while archers position themselves on the wall to attempt covering fire. Drum once again orders a closed formation, bracing for the impending storm of arrows as they advance. The desperate men of the north hurl stones and even bedding upon the enemy, while their archers and crossbowmen continue to deal death to the Ironborn scaling the outer wall, and causing them to fall like flies. Just as it seems the northerners have control, the rate of their fire begins to dwindle. Unbeknownst to the Ironborn, the garrison is running low on arrows, bolts, and even stones to throw. Sir Roderick and Sir Leopold know that hand-to-hand combat will be decisive here, while John's army is still nowhere to be seen. The Ironborn assault is formidable. Despite the casualties, they manage to scale the inner wall from the southern flank, where close combat breaks out in full force. Seeing the northerners begin to falter, Drum sends in the 2nd column to overwhelm the enemy. But just as the Ironborn starts capturing sections of the wall, Sir Leopold and his group of dismounted knights charge in a desperate bid to stabilize the situation. Quickly, men Tallheart shouted, cutting down any Ironborn in his way, "Let's send these bastards to their drowned god." The fight was fierce, blood blending with the stench of death around them. The northerners fought as if possessed, knowing that if the wall fell, they would face certain death. The Ironborn war horn boomed as more and more enemies swarmed up the assault ladders. The dismounted knights continued to cut through the attackers, holding them at bay. There were only 40 of them, including Sir Leopold, but their armor and martial skills helped compensate for the severe numerical disadvantage. Then a series of war horns, with a northern accent, sounded across the fortress. The message was clear: Sir Roderick was ordering a general retreat to the castle's citadel. Sir Leopold and his men began pulling back toward the last line of defense, helping get many northern soldiers to safety. Aware he had to prevent panic from spreading among the soldiers, Leopold raised his visor. "Quickly, men, the enemy!" Then came the sound of an armored body hitting the ground. In an unfortunate turn for the northern forces, Sir Leopold Tallheart died in action, struck by an arrow to the eye as he called orders to his men. The dismounted knights gathered their commander's body as best they could and carried it into the fortress while the enemy's morale soared, preparing for the final assault. Sir Roderick stood in the commander's courtyard, readying his men for a last stand. Silence filled the room when a messenger burst in. "Sir Roderick," he said, gasping for breath, "Sir Leopold has fallen." The young man's voice echoed. The old knight felt his eyes swell, his gaze distant, despair flooding his chest as he received the news. The silence in the hall was absolute, the only sound was the enemy battering ram pounding at the gate. Fear gripped the minds of the northerners beyond it. Many began to pray quietly as they prepared for the death that awaited them. The ironwood door began to give way when suddenly, the rumble of war drums echoed from the nearby woods. A collective hush fell over the battlefield as the action seemed to halt. A blast of a war horn sounded in the distance. Roderick's gaze returned as the soldiers of Blackpool cried out, "Stark! Stark! Stark!" The grey direwolf on a white field unfurled in full splendor, emerging from the forest. The White Wolf had arrived at Blackpool just in time. With Aaron's men fully committed to the assault and no reserves left, the battle was as good as over. John surveyed the situation from his position. With relief crossing his face, he said to Mira, "Today we were lucky, thanks to the gods." His aide replied, "The North won't fall today, my general." John drew his sword. With exhaustion etched on his face and knowing his men were worse off, he shouted, "For the North!" before pointing his sword forward and leading the charge. The response was direct and unanimous. A general charge saw the northerners put to the sword the few Ironborn left in the enemy camp. With the force of their charge, John's forces surged uphill to relieve the hard-pressed garrison. A thoroughly confused enemy tried to retreat in disarray as the garrison prepared for a sortie to strike them down. With the battle lost, Aaron and his guard fled the battlefield. John's army managed to encircle the enemy troops still in the castle, with Castle's garrison pressing them from behind. The Ironborn army was driven to the breaking point. Sir Roderick, full of energy, urged the troops to make a final effort. Drum, however, seemed to fall into a state of shock. Baylor Blacktide recalled, he looked without seeing, heard without hearing, and spoke not a word. The old, brave Reaver captain, with his head covered in white hair, no longer thought or responded. When Drum returned to his senses, it was too late. All around him, his men were dying, fleeing for their lives, or surrendering to the North en masse. Defeat was certain, and the Ironborn prepared for his last fight. Then he saw him. He saw the White Wolf cutting through his men as if they were butter. "I've lost the battle," he thought, "but at least I'll send this northern bastard to one of the 7 hells. Hey, wolf cunt! Come here and die like a man." Drum shouted at the northern general as he charged him. The White Wolf reacted, parrying Drum's blow, and engaging in single combat with the Ironborn captain. John knew that Drum's Valyrian sword, Red Rain, posed a threat, but Dunstan's age and exhaustion were showing. Because of this, John decided to rely on his style of speed and precise movement. Knowing that with each passing second, his chances of death increased, Drum attempted to corner John. But the bastard of Winterfell dodged each blow with grace and struck back at the Ironborn with precision. The deadly dance continued as both swordsmen realized that time was crucial. The old Dunstan began to lose his rhythm, growing increasingly defensive, as though the air was escaping his lungs. Then John saw his chance and went on the offensive. What had been a balanced duel for half a minute ended in seconds. 2 precise strikes from John saw his sword cut Drum beneath his right armpit and his left thigh. The old Ironborn lost his grip on his sword and fell to his knees, blood staining the snow. "Give me a warrior's death," the Ironborn requested. The White Wolf granted his request. Jon nodded solemnly and, with one precise movement, lifted Red Rain and drove it through the Ironborn's throat, thus claiming the price of iron and the sword. The captain's death prompted the last pockets of resistance to surrender to the Northerners. Northern riders pursued those who managed to escape. However, the pursuit soon dwindled. After a week of forced marches in dreadful conditions, with little time to rest or recover, Jon's men were on the verge of collapse. But the White Wolf was content with what his men had achieved. Battle of Blackpool. Casualties. North. 600. Greyjoy. 3,000. Aeron finds temporary refuge in Withered Fortress, where he discovers that Dagmar has ignored his orders and continues to besiege the house of the late Leopold Tallheart. Aeron has no time to think. Jon immediately sends Sir Roderick the cavalry in pursuit. The White Wolf orders the hero of Blackpool to locate and destroy the enemy in the narrow passes of the Blue Hills Valley. The Ironborn general rushes toward Dagmar's forces with the leader of the Northern Cavalry hot on his heels all the way. The second Greyjoy host has faded like a nightmare at dawn, and the stony shore, long haunted by Ironborn terror, may finally know peace. Samwell Tarly to Robb and Bran Stark, 30th of the 5th moon, 299. Jon has overcome his most difficult challenge yet as commander of the army. Despite being affected by the weather and initially being misled, he has shown brilliant flexibility and his usual energy to withstand the crisis and then triumph. Jon's victory may have strengthened his position in the eyes of the nobles and given the north a breather. But Moat Cailin remains the gateway to the north, and as long as it remains in Ironborn hands, Jon's mission and oath will not be complete. Aeron will return. And when he returns, he will find himself on a collision course with the White Wolf. As the Northern General embarks on the North's first amphibious assault. Notes. I hope you enjoyed the reading. This is my first work, also English is not my main language. So, if you see any mistake please tell me. If you have any constructive criticism or comments feel free to put it in the comment section. Chapter 3, Mayhem at Dusk, The Battle of Salt Spear. Summary. What the Ironborns could fail to admire the courageous old Aeron, never winded by defeat, having been forced to march from the stony shore to the neck by foot now stood the humiliation, determined to see his man live. Mira Reed. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 6th moon, 299. The war between the North and the Iron Throne seems to be slowly tilting in favor of the North. In the Westerlands, King Robb Stark has secured his dominance over the region by capturing Ashimok. In the Riverlands, the army of the River Lords under the command of Sir Edmure Tully and the Northern Infantry led by Lord Roose Bolton have defeated Sir Gregor Clegane in the Battle of the Fords and are beginning to advance towards Harrenhal slowly. Meanwhile, on the home front, Jon's brilliant victory at Blackpool has forced Aeron to flee towards Dagmar's forces at Torrens Square, where they continue to besiege the Tallheart household. Following his victory at Blackpool, Jon managed to regain control over the western region of the north and granted the Northerners a sigh of relief. The recapture of Deepwood and Blackpool ensures he can now begin his campaign to liberate Moat Cailin, the gate of the north from the Squid's control without worrying about protecting his rear. However, territorial gains and morale boosts aren't the only things the recent victories over the Ironborn have left behind. These two victories have brought something the North hasn't seen since the days of Brandon the Burner, a war fleet worthy of the name. The decisive victories and the captures of Blacksword and Deepwood have resulted in the surrender and capture of nearly all the ships that had transported the two invading forces from the west. After the final count, the Northerners seized over 70 ships, including warships, transports, and supply vessels. This has given Jon and the North a not insignificant 6th place ranking in terms of fleets in Westeros. These vessels are crewed and operated by seasoned sailors in the form of slaves and prisoners who have been freed by the North. Offered pay and protection, they have sworn loyalty to their liberators. Almost overnight, Jon has formed the North's first fleet in thousands of years. Simultaneously, Jon has also begun implementing some of his tactical innovations, like square formations for the spearmen, training of a new contingent of pikesmen, and volley fire techniques for crossbowmen and archers. Jon knows that the Ironborn can be defeated easily due to the North's traditional discipline and general superiority on land. However, these reforms will take time to bear fruit and have a darker significance. The reforms are aimed at countering the well-organized southern armies. Jon focuses particularly on countering the element that the north critically lacks, heavy cavalry. The White Wolf knows that should they meet in the open field, the northerners must neutralize the south's famous mounted knights. Sir Roderick is the primary supporter of Jon's reforms. The knight knows firsthand the devastating danger posed by those charges. By doing this, Jon is preparing for a future fierce war against the southern kingdoms with a new approach to warfare. These reforms will become the core of his famed Jonian art of war, which will see the northern army enter a rhythm for an eventual confrontation against the south. A scenario that will prove prophetic. While Jon begins reforming his army, Aeron and the remnants of the two invading armies reach Torrens Square. The survivors' numbers reveal the magnitude of the disaster. Only 900 and one of the two commanders from two forces that once numbered over 7,000 men have managed to reach the outskirts of House Tallheart's home. Dagmar, for his part, has suffered significant losses during his siege. He now has only 600 of the 800 he once had under his command. The encounter between Dagmar and Aeron is cold and brief, as is the overall mood of the army. The soldiers have dulled, grimy, and broken armor. The swords show wear, and the boots and boiled leather are falling apart on their backs and feet. 30% of the soldiers are sick or wounded and must be transported on the few remaining wagons. The 1,500 Ironborn no longer pose a real threat to the north, and there are rumors that a column of 2,500 Stark soldiers is marching from Winterfell. Demoralized and lacking the stomach to continue the fight, Aeron and Dagmar quickly decide to abandon the place and withdraw south to Moat Cailin and Victorion's forces. However, both leaders know that it's easier said than done. Even in early autumn, the northern terrain and cold weather are lethal. The retreating men have already been decimated, mostly by frostbite in their extremities or, in the most extreme cases, death by hypothermia. Still, Aeron and Dagmar face a difficult decision. There are only two possible routes south: march over 120 kilometers eastward to Wayfarer's Watch, the castle stronghold, and then advance nearly 400 kilometers south along the King's Road, known as the Plains Path. Or head south towards Goldgrass, at the mouth of the Fever River, the home of House Stout, 450 kilometers from their position through the Barrowlands Mountains by the path known as the Spine of the Ancients. Knowing that the Starks will come to finish them off if they don't move, that the weather will only worsen, and that supplies are scarce, Aeron decides to gamble on the mountain route. It is a decision made without knowledge of the terrain. And one that forces Dagmar and Aeron to abandon anyone who cannot fend for themselves. The Ironborn leave behind all their sick and wounded. Aeron has sent a messenger to the Tallhearts, hoping that the Northerners will take in those left to their fate. The Tallheart response will lead to one of the war's most tragic episodes. With news of Sir Leopold's death and Lord Benfred's passing from grave injuries during the Ironborn's first attack, Lady Edara Tallheart, Lady of Torrens Square, orders the capture of the invaders. She commands that every single one of them is left in the surrounding woods. All 400 captured soldiers will die from exposure or become prey for predators in the coming weeks. Lady Edara was never called to account for her actions, in her own words from her journal. If the hungry wolf did so when the Andals invaded us, why can't I do the same with those who have pillaged my lands and killed my family for generations? Despite his achievements, Robb, from Ashmark, repeatedly sends letters to Jon with urgent, inflammatory messages. The king in the north orders his half-brother to fulfill his original mission. Jon's resentment grows as Robb chastises him for what he and his war council see as an unwarranted deviation from his assigned mission. The letter, signed by his brother, even suggests that in the south they hold him responsible for jeopardizing their grand strategy. Unbeknownst to Jon, Robb Stark had devised an ambitious plan to regain the upper hand in the war and deliver a severe blow to the Lannisters. Part of that plan depends on Jon retaking Moat Cailin as soon as possible and marching quickly south. Once in the Riverlands, the White Wolf is to join forces with Roose Bolton and his Trident army. Together, they are to reconquer the southeastern bank of the Trident as far as Harrenhal. From there, the Northerners will threaten the Crown lands, and with the Westerlands ravaged and pressure from all sides, they'll force King Joffrey and Tywin Lannister to seek peace. It's a plan that seems logical on paper, a multi-front offensive that will strike a series of dagger-like blows into the heart of Lannister power, breaking it and bringing it to its knees. But Jon hates the entire idea. Not only does the dismissive tone and veiled threats in his half-brother's pompous words enrage him, but he also feels the plan is unrealistic and completely absurd. Frustrated, he confides in his logistics officer and friend, Samuel Tully. "My brother and my king are now two different people," John began. The former was someone who would always analyze situations from a realistic perspective. Someone who would never let the nonsensical, utterly useless, and foolish southern notions of birthright fill his thoughts, let alone fall into strategic delusions. He said this before draining his water flask. "In this abomination known as royal orders, there's no sense at all. I can't understand how anyone who has ever seen a map of Westeros and has any competence in military command could have thought this plan and its demands reasonable." John paused as his love and trust for his brother were shattered by a single letter. "Robb and his council know full well that I cannot do what they ask. I've brought them 2 victories, defended Winterfell, and captured over 70 ships. Yet it seems that in the south, they think I've been cowering behind the walls of my home for the past month." His treacherous mind whispered once again what his stepmother had always reminded him: he is Lord Stark's true-born son, not a mere accident who was shown pity. "He's threatening my position as general. He writes between the lines as if he's considering I might betray him. He describes a situation where it seems my bastardy makes me incompetent, arrogant, and disrespectful." Finally overcome by rage, he threw the letter into the fire. "All this while demanding I retake Moat Cailin within a month. I'm outnumbered, more than 1,200 kilometers from the moat, and he thinks I can actually do this." After a brief pause in which his gaze drifted into the distance, he added, "I can see that my stepmother's poisonous words and the pompous flatterers in the south have finally begun to take their toll on my brother. I can't believe he would think of this as a sound decision." John didn't just feel anger boiling within him, he felt the weight of a double war, one in the north and another with his brother, threatening to break his resolve. Then the White Wolf lifted his head and said, "Sam." "Yes, John," replied Tully. "We never received any letter." The firstborn of Hornhill smiled and solemnly replied, "It seems the southern ravens don't fly well in these conditions, General." As he left the tent alone, as he tried to reconcile his best friend and brother with this impostor wearing a metal circlet, John said to himself, "There will be time to settle matters with His Majestic Majesty when all of this is over," he thought. "There's still a war to fight, one to win, and a pair of sisters to rescue," he finished in his mind. John knows from the ravens from Torrens Square that the Ironborn have left the Tall Heart home, and from tracks and scouts, reports indicate they are heading south. Their destination is clear, Moat Cailin, but the route the Ironborn will take remains uncertain. The Goldgrass route is more direct, but the terrain makes it a dangerous challenge, even for those familiar with it. Meanwhile, the King's Road is longer but relatively safer. John discusses this with Hojan, Mira, Sir Roderick, and Sam. They all agree that, given their situation, it's more likely the Ironborn will take the most direct route toward the Fever River mouth. They also acknowledge that even if they were to catch up with them, attrition would result in unacceptable losses. Therefore, intercepting them before they reach the river mouth is impossible, unless they do something drastic and entirely unexpected. The debate drags on all afternoon without the Northern Army's War Council reaching a consensus. That night, to relieve his frustrations, John goes to the nearby hill overlooking the coast in the village of Blacksword. While the cold coastal wind clears his mind and blows away his frustrations along with his hair, the general sees the newly acquired fleet, 30 warships and just over 40 transport and supply vessels. He watches as soldiers resupply the beached ships, repair a few holes, and train local volunteers in their roles. The other 10 ships are exercising despite the dangers of night navigation, proving that the freed sailors are more than capable of facing the dangerous western coast of the north. The scene relaxes John as he observes the ship's maneuvers despite the night's darkness. The general stares at the tides when, suddenly, an idea occurs to him. The Ironborn have always held naval supremacy over the Sunset Sea, but recent victories have significantly reduced their dominance. After interrogating both Asher and Theon, John has learned that contrary to rumors, the Iron Fleet only consists of 100 heavy warships and 80 galleys, along with some private squadrons from various corsairs. Under questioning, Asher confesses that only 80 heavy ships participated in the invasion, while many galleys were lost to storms or remained in the Iron Islands. According to Mira's reports, The North is now the proud owner of 40 of those heavy ships, meaning the Ironborn only has a numerical advantage of 60 to 40. To add to the tally, only 40 of those are currently present off the North's shores, which leaves, on paper, an even numerical fight. An idea starts to take root in the White Wolf's mind. It's an all-in gamble, one that could earn Jon enough prestige and political favor to silence the veiled threats in Robb's letter. Jon returns to the command tent, where he calls an urgent meeting. The eldest member of Jon's council, Sir Roderick, vehemently opposes the idea. "It's complete folly," General Roderick said. "Northerners have no experience in naval battles, and it's a risky venture that could cost the North any gains made." Samwell remains ambivalent, not entirely convinced of the plan. His concern isn't about the plan's military feasibility but the apparent logistical suicide of attempting the landing Jon proposed. Without food or water, the army wouldn't even be able to fight off ants, Sam concludes. However, Jon is determined to proceed and decides to explain his plan. "Aaron's forces will take almost 2 weeks to reach the river," he said, pointing at the map. "By ship, it's a shorter and relatively safer journey than any forced march through the western northern hills and mountains." After a pause, the general concluded, "Besides, we don't have many other options if we want to follow our orders." The silence was as cold and final as the late summer air. No one knows if Robb will make good on his threat, but Jon isn't willing to lose his position or give nobles who despise him a reason to push Robb to do so. The youngest members of the War Council also worry about this threat. Even the reluctant Sir Roderick trusts Jon and values having him as their general. It is ambition, mixed with youth, that leads Sewin and the Reed siblings to agree with his plan. When Jon demonstrates that the houses surrounding the Fever River have enough grain stored for months of operations, Samwell agrees to join the Northern Gambit. Even so, Sir Roderick continues to be reluctant about this plan. The old knight recalls the Greyjoy rebellion. Castle states, "My general, on land, the Northern army can win decisive victories thanks to its superior equipment, tactics, and discipline, but at sea, it's a different story." He pauses and says, "The ships may be first-rate, but neither you nor I have experience at sea." He says, despairing, trying to dissuade the young from risking everything in one move. Then it's time for the North to remember that owning half of West Eos forests is a sign that the sea should be our domain, exclaimed Sewin. However, Jon remained silent, allowing the old knight to voice his true fear. "General, if we are intercepted at sea, our annihilation will be nearly certain. Between here and the mouth of the Fever River, there are almost 650 kilometers, a journey of 8 to 10 days, depending on the winds. There are no naval bases until Ryswell territory. It's known that autumn storms will soon begin, larger fleets have been lost due to the gods' whims." But the decision was already firmly rooted in the minds of the younger captains, and their concerns were dismissed. "The future presents 2 choices before us, Sir Roderick, a bold gambit or conservative prudence," spoke the heir to Greywater Watch. "And it's known that the old gods favor the bold," Hojan declared. Seeing himself outnumbered and having witnessed the results of Jon's ideas and tactics, Sir Roderick decided to agree and accept the plan. "If that is your decision, General, though I do not share it, I will follow you." It was obvious he was not fully convinced of the idea. However, he was a loyal soldier, and, with the decision made, he would do everything possible to ensure the North's victory. "That's all I ask, sir. You will see that we'll be at the Fever River in 6 days, and with a bit of luck, we'll have put the ocean's squids in retreat." The council was dismissed afterward, and the captains went to execute the orders they'd received. However, perhaps Jon himself was the one who doubted his own idea the most. As he emerged from the tent and observed the coast, the general pondered over the plan he had proposed. He knew this decision was a gamble. A bold move that could win him the North's respect and the chapter in history he'd always dreamed of, or cost him his life and the future of the army he'd built with blood and sacrifice. Looking toward the sky and thinking of his father, the bastard of Eddard Stark thought, "I will prove I'm not your one mistake, father. They will say with pride that you had 6 children. I hope I make you proud." To permanently destroy the threat of the Ironborn, the time has come for us to take control of the Sunset Sea. Jon Stark to Mira Reed, 6th moon of 299. 2nd day of the 6th moon, 299. 4,500 men of the Northern Army, aboard 80 transport ships and just as many logistics vessels, escorted by 40 warships, sail along the rocky coasts on a journey into the unknown. Aboard the flagship, the Black Wolf, sails the General, and now Admiral, John Stark. Vomiting is a constant on the northern decks as a landlocked nation seeks to grow its sea legs. Those men not emptying their stomachs feel the wind blowing their hair, a kind wind gifted by the gods. A strong, non-hurricane wind drives the northern ships swiftly across the sea. The sea, vast and ruthless like an eternal giant, stretches before them. The swift ships, with rowers straining their oars, break the waves with the wind's gentle breath, covering the distance the White Wolf needs. Confident but cautious, the northern expedition sails along the rocky coast without incident and with favorable winds on the first day. They recapture the island fortresses of Slate Watch and Heron Rest with little resistance. By nightfall, after nearly 120 kilometers covered, they dock near Lunker Island, within House Fisher's territory. The men, still seasick, try to rest on deck, unaware that tension remains high along the coast. The Fishers have successfully defended their home, Whitecaster Castle, and during the night have chased Ironborn raiders to Reaver's Watch, the coastal village across from Lunker Island. With the first rays of sunlight emerging over the horizon, the northerners at Lunker are alerted by shouts and ringing bells from the shore. 8 light galleys, escorted by 2 larger ships, approach them with sails unfurled. The few sailors observing from Lunker sound the bells, awakening the northerners, who plunge into chaos as they try to don their armor and take their positions. The northern fleet awakens, believing the entire enemy fleet has found them and is advancing. It's only their vanguard, declares Sir Roderick, attempting to calm the nervous soldiers. The northerners' inexperience at sea is all too apparent. The northern captains deploy their ships in a tight formation, with a far larger reserve than necessary and no maneuverability on the flanks. It's an understandable series of mistakes. The northerners unconsciously plan the battle as if it were on land. 12 light galleys form a rigid line at the front of the formation. The heavier ships concentrate in the center, with lighter vessels on the flanks, standing still as they wait for the enemy. Their only saving grace is that the island conceals the true number of ships in their fleet. The Ironborn only see the northern galleys and, believing they are an isolated group, the raiders charge at the northern squadron. The Ironborn's superiority and experience allow them to lure the northern galleys toward them, striking them quickly and forcefully, forcing the northerners into a defensive stance. The captain of the Ironborn fleet continues with his traditional doctrine. With the enemy masts and hulls damaged, the raiders attempt to settle the confrontation by boarding the enemy ships. Within minutes, the Ironborn invade the decks of the northern galleys. The fighting is brutal and unexpected. Yet experience in these engagements proves insufficient against northern armor. The seasoned infantry soldiers manage to form up in the center of the decks and engage in a way that benefits them. As their numbers dangerously dwindle, the Ironborn raiding leader enters the fray with the rest of his men. But as the minutes pass, he begins to consider that this attack was a mistake. Not until he has fully committed his forces and the northern infantry gradually pushes them back, does the Greyjoy Corsair realize his miscalculation. The morning mist and Lunker Island have concealed the rest of the northern fleet. The northern fleet now charges the Ironborn ships entangled with the vanguard galleys. John watches the battle through a small spyglass. His body is rigid, his jaw clenched as events unfold. Thank the gods it wasn't the entire enemy fleet, he says as the ships under Hojan and Mira's command enter the fray. The warships and experienced crews prove their worth by ramming and sinking 6 of the 8 enemy ships. The battle allows the northerners to board and capture the 2 central ships in the formation. Sir Roderick arrives with his ships, reinforcing the galleys still threatened by the enemy boarders. Leaping into combat with young Sir Wyn at his side, they carve a bloody path through the invaders. The Ironborn who boarded the northern galleys were pushed into the sea, executed, or forced to surrender. In 15 minutes, it is all over. The battle has been short, but it has shown John and his captains that Sir Roderick's concerns may not have been unfounded. The initial formation and action were an utter disaster, one that none of the captains even tried to conceal. To John, it had been a tactical and strategic blunder that was fortunate enough not to have had more serious consequences than allowing the Ironborn to take the initiative. Sir Roderick referred to it as the reflection of what thousands of years without combat experience does to a people. Moira Reed would write in her memoirs, "Never have so many mistakes been made in battle as that day. And never before had such mistakes had so little impact on the outcome." Hogan Reed exclaimed, "It's clear that if this had been real, we would be lost," when he saw the formation taken by the galley captains. Years later, Cleesewin would speak of the incident, saying, "They say to be good with a sword, you must experience bleeding and even taste death. It's good that our naval baptism was with wooden swords." If the Ironborn had had their full fleet present at Lunker, the White Wolf's life would likely have been far less heroic, the Maestas would write after the war. But perhaps no one summarized the matter better than historian Brandon Reed. At Lunker, it was shown that naval tactics require a flexibility and adaptability unknown to the Northern Army. The damaged galleys are docked at Reaver's Watch for repairs, while John decides that the island of Lunker would make a good naval base. He orders the fisher sergeant, who has landed on the shore, to start work on constructing a shipyard on the island and to fortify Reaver's Watch. Leaving the wounded in the village, the Northern fleet prepares to continue on its way. Morale and confidence have risen among the Northern soldiers, but doubts grow among the captains as the rest of the day passes without incident. By noon, the Northerners have passed the 3 islands off the coast of Deep Lure, known as the Bait Islands, and an hour before sunset, the convoy reaches the island of Skipstone. In 2 days, they have covered 240 kilometers of the journey. The Ironborn ships are fast, maneuverable, and light. Combined with the rowers' experience and favorable winds, the pace has been far above what Samwell had estimated. The calculation of their progress is possible thanks to maps from the coastal villages, provided by the locals at the Northerners' nightly stops, and the confirmation of places they've reached. And as night falls, the Northerners have, despite everything, enjoyed a favorable journey. However, Lunker's changes and repercussions are immediately felt. The Northern captains have determined that should they encounter the Ironborn, they need to develop a doctrine capable of giving them reasonable chances of success. "Our strengths are in close combat and battle order," John declares. "Our weakness is our lack of experience in complex maneuvers." After a pause, the general reveals his idea. "If we want to win, we must turn a naval battle into a land one." He pauses and sees all eyes are on him. The Ironborn excel at weakening the enemy. They try to sink enemy ships from a distance and then board the remaining ones. "If we can close the distance as quickly as possible and force the enemy into a land-style battle on floating platforms, the day will be ours," John concludes. The White Wolf has been clever. Boarding, the feared final tool of the Ironborn, may be the key to Northern victory. The captains understand and accept their general's idea. The plan is laid out. The Northerners must attack and ram or board the enemy ships as soon as they have the chance. Sir Roderick even suggests an idea. "If we locate the enemy fleet during the afternoon, it might be best to attack at nightfall. Surprise and the initial momentum will give us the opportunity." This comment lingers in John's mind as the meeting comes to an end. The 3rd day dawns with a clear sky and a strong wind. The ocean remains so calm that John is reminded, at moments, of the hot springs of Winterfell. The stillness of the sea prompts the rowers to voice their concerns to the general. "Rarely is the sea so benevolent to those who travel it," General says a grey-bearded crew member. Seasickness continues among the soldiers, who have yet to find their sea legs, as the Northern convoy sails at great speed over the sunset sea. Despite the seemingly endless sea, the last lights of the day reveal Farstone, the largest island between Blackpool and their destination, marking the threshold of the Fisher Lands. And despite the initial doubts, by the 4th night, the Direwolf's forces dock off the island of Rushcrest, a territory of House Glenmore, vassals of House Riswell. Since the Greyjoy Rebellion, Rushcrest has become a strategic location. Situated across from the coast of Glenmore Lands and halfway between Blackpool and the Fever River, it's the perfect place for the Northerners to rest and resupply. Together with the Fisher Islands, from Rushcrest to Lunker, they form the so-called Shield Islands of the North, and, along with Bear Island, they had been the only ones capable of halting the Ironborn assaults head-on since the start of the war. Seeing the fortresses along the way, John understands why the Ironborn have pushed up to Deepwood and Blackpool. But what attracts John the most is the proof these islands present. The Shield Islands are proof that, despite the lack of a navy, the westernmost part of the north can be protected from the Ironborn's constant raids. They also represent a logistical relief, albeit partial, for developing the new Northern fleet. The 5th day sees them advancing to Greenbrook, the last stop between the Northerners and Spearwatch Island at the mouth of the Fever River. Apart from the minor skirmish at Lunker, the Northerners have arrived practically without incidents. At sunset on the 6th day, John and the Northerners have completed a journey that, until recently, was unthinkable. They have covered 550 kilometers in 6 days. And with the last light of day, the Northerners stop at the fortress of Blazewater Watch, just 30 kilometers west of the mouth of Salt Spear, the gulf preceding the Fever River. On the night of the 8th day of the 6th moon, a Northern War Council is held. Sir Roderick is the first to speak. General, reports from the Flints indicate enemy ships in Pockmark, while Lord Walton reports that the Ironborn control Drumlin town, and Lord Wells informs us that Stillmead and Dalden Keep have been lost. After placing a few coins on the map to mark these locations, the old knight continues. In total, estimates suggest there are between 40 and 60 enemy warships, along with a considerable contingent of galleys and transport ships. The silence continues as the figures representing the enemy are placed. Given the risk of attempting to penetrate further into the Gulf of Salt Spear, I suggest landing at Atwater Hold and marching by land toward Goldgrass and then to Moldgate to trap Aaron between us and the mountains. The first to respond is Samwell. The logistics of a landing would prevent us from marching quickly enough. There are 150 kilometers between Atwater and Goldgrass, along with 2 river crossings. With your plan, sir, Aaron will have reached, looted, and left Moldgate before we even reach Goldgrass. The head of logistics then points to the map. The only way we can arrive in a reasonable time is to land at Drumlin Town or Port Wayne, despite the risks involved. From there, we'd be 70 kilometers from Goldgrass and could head toward Moldgate in the time we need. The other captains remain on the sidelines as the debate between Sir Roderick and Samwell continues. When they finish, the more youthful minds lean, once more, toward the riskier option. John then points to Stillmead and Port Wayne and says, "Here, within 24 hours, we will be here or at the bottom of the ocean." At dawn on the 9th day, the atmosphere within the fleet was tense. The wind whistled around the decks of the northern ships as, one by one, they departed Blazewater Watch and set sail toward Salt Spear. The Northerners knew that if Victorian's fleet managed to intercept them, the Ironborn's maritime skill would all but guarantee a northern defeat in equal numbers. The sea, which had remained calm during their voyage around the stony shores, began to roll as the morning mist from the neck reduced their visibility. With a chill sharper than that of recent days, doubts about the plan's viability started to arise among the crew. The murmur grew stronger on Sir Roderick's command ship. "Steady, men. The gods stand with the bold, not the trembling." Sir Roderick's reassuring words silenced the murmurs, and the crew focused on their duties, with only the rowers breaking the silence. The old knight was in charge of the vanguard. He harbored the most doubts but knew that sowing uncertainty among the sailors and soldiers would serve no purpose. He fully supported his general's plan, and despite his fears, he trusted that if not for their tactics, then luck and the gods would grant them victory. The fog remained an issue, but thanks to the Ironborn's coastal fires, Sir Roderick was able to locate Pockmark by mid-morning successfully. The fires revealed a considerable force, however, the numbers didn't add up. It was barely a third of the fires needed to hold back the northern fleet. Sir Roderick decided to take risks and sent a light galley to investigate the enemy fleet more closely. Then, an unexpected opportunity arose. Unbeknownst to the Northerners, the Ironborn had divided their forces into 3 groups, one at Pockmark and one at Drumlin Town, patrolling Salt Spear's entrance. The light galley identified the Pockmark group as consisting of 15 warships and 5 galleys, the same number stationed at Drumlin. The other 10 warships were returning from the Iron Islands, escorting transports carrying reinforcements. Boulogne Greyjoy, having learned of the disasters at Blackpool and Tumbleown, had sent 5,000 men to Victorian. Thus, the 10 enemy ships were in Feverview, the coastal village at the mouth of the Fever River. Sir Roderick was unaware of the state of the other enemy fleet segments, but the plan was to raise the combat flags as soon as enemy ships were located. Upon raising the flag, the rest of the fleet quickly moved to join them. The Battle of Pockmark was about to begin. "Prepare yourselves," men, John shouted as his soldiers took positions and the rowers began to pick up speed. The general's hands tightened as he donned his visor helmet and checked his sword one last time. The strategy was simple: strike quickly at the invaders and board as many ships as possible before they could escape. The northern ships emerged from the fog and destroyed the few enemy ships guarding access to Pockmark. Many Ironborns were on land and were helpless as they watched the northerners board and capture the sparsely crewed Greyjoy ships. The northern boardings inspired a revolt among the slave rowers. Many of them were northerners who saw this as their chance to regain their freedom and pay back the suffering they had endured at the hands of their captors. Half an hour later, the heavy ships were either sunk or captured. The first Ironborn group had been destroyed, while those on land were now isolated in hostile territory. Jon decided to ignore them. The Northerners had secured a significant victory and had an opportunity to strike a final blow to the Iron Fleet at Drumlin. Northern swords were cleaned of blood as the few wounded were tended to below decks. The scene was gruesome. Without adequate medical supplies, many injuries could not be properly treated. Jon felt nauseous watching a young man his age have his hand amputated, and he was forced to empty his stomach. "Naval warfare is truly dreadful," he would later say. The weather began to turn, the wind blowing against them and slowing the Northern fleet's progress. It wasn't until sunset, with the last light of the sun, that the Northerners arrived at Drumlin and sighted the second Ironborn squadron. However, the fleet before them had 20 warships and 10 galleys, far more than they had anticipated. For a brief moment, a sepulchral silence filled the hearts of the Northern soldiers, threatening to unleash panic. The murmurs escalated until Jon raised the Stark banner, and the flagship advanced toward the enemy. The Northern fleet seemed to react immediately, moving forward to follow their general. Nightfall aided the White Wolf in surprising the Ironborn. Their lack of discipline was evident. They were preparing dinner, and removing armor, and some were already asleep. Suddenly, the night's peace was shattered. Without warning, 40 Northern ships emerged from nowhere to send the Ironborn to their drowned god. Most awoke to the sounds of battle drums and northern war cries as the Direwolf's ships crashed against the surprised squids. Some captains and crews managed to form a coherent battle line, but, when 10 northern ships under Mira's command slid along the eastern shore and managed to flank the line, the Ironborn lost heart and began to attempt to retreat. Under pressure from all sides, most of the ships raised white flags and surrendered, while the rear, composed of about 10 ships led by Lord Maron Vomark, managed to escape westward, sailing back against the wind to the Iron Islands. In just 45 minutes, the Northerners managed to destroy or capture 15 of the enemy's heavy ships and deal a lasting blow to the Ironborn naval capacities. Stark ordered that all prisoners and slaves on board be freed and offered a place in the Northern Navy, which almost everybody accepted. However, 5 ships could not be crewed. Jon decided to set them ablaze with prisoners who had resisted the boarding or refused to march to the wall still on board. "A terrible, but effective example," he said to his officers. Battle of Salt Spear. Casualties: North, 400. 2 damaged ships. Greyjoy, 2,000. 25 warships were captured or sunk. 15 galleries sunk. In a single night, the White Wolf had forever crippled the Ironborn's naval power, giving rise to the Ballad of the Sea Wolves. A romantic and valiant tale recounts how the mighty, brave, and handsome White Wolf and his squad, the Maester, the Old Knight, and the Swamp Lads, the scourge of the squids and protectors of the dispossessed, had always planned to destroy the enemy navy and never doubted their victory. Ballad of the Sea Wolves. In the dark night, a tide did grow. The wind whispered and the sky did roar. With icy claws and cunning fierce, the White Wolf advanced, bold without fear. Riding the north relentlessly, he goes. His gaze is of steel, and his fate is forged below. Before him the squids, once proud in the tide, now bleeding fall, their power denied. He is not alone in this marine quest. The Maester follows, with wisdom blessed. The Old Knight, seasoned in war's cruel art. And the Swamp Lads, cunning and sharp. Sea wolves arise, guardians bold. Staunch defenders of the North's cold hold. Scourge of iron and shadow at dawn. The waves declare their swift triumph drawn. They sailed unseen, in mist concealed. With plans forged in fire and night revealed. To crush the Ironborn is our aim. They swore at dawn, on the brink of a dream. They never faltered, nor in tides adverse. For their brave souls dispersed all fear's curse. In one swift night, fate was sealed. for those pirates who yielded at steel. Sea wolves arise, guardians bold, staunch defenders of the North's cold hold. Scourge of iron and shadow at dawn, the waves declare their swift triumph drawn. The white wolf, with a calm visage grand, shone on the prow like a star so bright. His sword laid bare, his eyes aflame, and in each strike, the sea sang his name. The maester, the knight, and the fearless swamp folk were his shadows, his creed, his unbroken yoke. For the dispossessed and fallen of North, vengeance was theirs that night henceforth. Sea wolves arise, guardians bold, staunch defenders of the North's cold hold. Scourge of iron and shadow at dawn, the waves declare their swift triumph drawn. Today their names are sung on distant coasts, by humble men and ancient ghosts. For in one night of fire and steel, the wolf and his squad shattered their keel. The Ironborn mourned, defeated in shame, their fleet now rubble, their reign now lame. And thus in the North, where the wolf does reign, the sea wolves dance their waltz again. The moon watches, silent in its sky. The wind names them, eternal on high. They guarded their home, their honor, their creed. Sea wolves they were on that blessed eve. Sea wolves they are, brave lords indeed. If only they knew the truth, Samuel would say to John after hearing the song for the first time. The myth of the white wolf reached unforeseen heights. So much so that John would later refer to it in the following way. The white wolf is a mythical figure. He is a symbol embodying all the traditional values of the North, its ideals and its patriotism. He represents virtue in its most unexpected form, for he is someone who should have cared the least for the common folk, as he had no obligation to them aside from his personal honor, an honor that, as a bastard, was never expected of him in great measure. He is an outcast who protects them, a bastard. Someone who did not enjoy the privileges of nobility in his youth and bore no responsibility toward the people beyond his moral code and personal convictions. And yet, he is a bastard who, when he held all the power as king, never forgot his people. To the common folk, he is one of them, one of their own, sent and destined by the gods to safeguard the North and its people. John Stark to Sansa Stark on the myths of the White Wolf. There is no curse strong enough to enclose the magnitude of the mess we're in now. Victory and Greyjoy to his captains, 12th of the 6th moon of 299. John sends his steward, Hojan, to Winterfell to present the captured helmets of over 26 ship captains as his army celebrates the victory and enjoys a couple of days' rest. However, on other fronts, the war hasn't gone as well for the North. King Robb Stark has been injured while taking the fortress of the Crag, and, in the Riverlands, Lord Roose Bolton, despite his strategic blunders, manages a costly victory at the Battle of Harrenhal. This means that reinforcements are desperately needed in the south, and the pressure on Jon to retake Moat Cailin is greater than ever. He and his men are exhausted, some sick, and must face the task of containing the 10,000 desperate Ironborn. But containment is not enough, they must confront and defeat a force that outnumbers them 2-1 in an increasingly limited time frame. To complicate matters further, diplomatic concerns frustrate Jon and his team. In the south, King Robb Stark decided to marry Jane Westerling after sleeping with her and dishonoring her. In doing so, Robb Stark has broken his promise to marry a daughter of House Frey. And at the worst possible time, rumors of betrayal against the Starks begin to spread across the Barrowlands. The phrase most often heard among the common folk is, "The traitors are waiting for the critical moment, the moment to stab the Starks in the back." To secure his rear, Jon convinces Bran to pass a law as the Stark of Winterfell. It's a highly controversial law for the nobles, but without opposition from the high nobility, it passes without issue. It will be known as the Snow Law. The law authorizes General Jon Stark with all the powers necessary to ensure the North's safety. However, what fuels the rumors is the part that absolves him of the obligation to consult with the king or inform the southern lords. The common folk see the law with a certain reassurance: if you have nothing to hide and you are loyal, then you have nothing to fear. Jon's move is applauded by the minor nobles and the common folk. They feel safe under the protection of the White Wolf. "He will bring these traitors to justice," said Bran Stark upon its proclamation, causing the people of Winterfell to rally in support of the idea. Despite its necessity, actions like these feed rumors reaching Robb's ears. The ambitions of this popular bastard general seem to be spiraling out of control. could he, someday, prove a traitor to his legitimate brother and attempt a coup in the north. However, such talk will be irrelevant if Jon fails to secure the north and if Robb keeps losing men in the south. That same moon, when the Ironborn march once again to crush his forces, Jon will face his most skilled opponent yet. Lord Captain Victorian Greyjoy is the first man to make the White Wolf suffer on the battlefield. The Stony Shore campaign has ended in a crushing victory, securing Jon's place in command of the Northern Army. But Moat Cailin remains in enemy hands, and the southern nobles are still looking for an excuse to remove him. As the Northerners recover and prepare their defenses, Victorian Greyjoy devises a strategy to show the White Wolf that he still has the stomach for the fight. Temperatures drop, and the swamps of the Neck will be stained with blood when the seasoned raider clashes with the rising bastard star of the north. Notes. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Feel free to make any theory you have on the comments. I know that is not the traditional writing style, so please tell me what do you think. This is my first work, also English is not my main language. So, if you see any mistake please tell me. If you have any constructive criticism or comments feel free to put it in the comment section. Chapter 4, An Estuary on the Fever, The Battle of Chel. Summary. Outnumbered, undersupplied, and pushed to the brink by Victorian Greyjoy's relentless advance, Jon Stark faces his toughest challenge to date as the war in the north reaches its most desperate phase. A string of setbacks, bitter weather, and costly mistakes bring the Northern Army closer than ever to collapse, and for the first time, Jon struggles in the battlefield. Yet from retreat, exhaustion, and near disaster, a daring counterstroke is forged. The brutal and chaotic struggle at Chel will decide the fate of the entire campaign, and it is there that the legend of the White Wolf truly begins to take its shape. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 7th moon, 299. 4 moons had passed since General Jon Stark took command of the Northern Army. Since then, Stark has carried out a series of brilliant operations against the Ironborn and has won a handful of battles characterized by bold maneuvers. Now, the bastard general appears close to fully liberating the north from the invasion of the Greyjoy raiders. He has driven the Greyjoy field forces from the western coast, capturing or killing nearly every man from 2 armies. At sea, his recently established fleet has secured a crucial victory at Salt Spear, driving the Ironborn from the place they have always ruled, the seas. Victorian Greyjoy's army, the last Greyjoy fighting force on the continent, is nearing starvation, and disease is beginning to spread among the invaders while morale is at its lowest point. In such precarious conditions, Jon decides to appeal to their commander, Lord Captain Victorian Greyjoy, to surrender, but General Stark knows well how the Ironborn mind works. He knows that any attempt to reason with the invaders while they believe they still have a chance will be useless. To add to Jon's troubles, Victorian is a hard old veteran forged in Robert's Rebellion, Bolon's Rebellion, and in countless raiding campaigns. The old Ironborn acts according to the old ways and, by all accounts, he will not surrender while any hope of victory or escape from the north remains. Victorian knows that, to the west, the last fresh reinforcements sent by his brother managed to land before the disaster at Salt Spear and are now marching toward Moat Cailin. Many are indeed novices or greybeards, a desperate measure taken by Lord Bolon to replace the losses suffered by Aeron, Asher, and Theon, poorly trained and short of experienced officers. But they helped raise the strength of the Ironman's field army to 15,000 men. Victorian's leadership helps steady the morale and minds of the soldiers, as he is regarded as brave, bold, and cunning, the best land commander the islands have produced in generations. Victorian and his captains draw up a new plan, a renewed offensive to crush the northern field forces, capture Goldgrass, and obtain enough supplies to hold out until the Iron Fleet can regroup and evacuate them, or secure terms with the Starks that would allow the Ironborn to return to their homeland. The Ironborn plan is divided into 3 main efforts. The first group, led by Victorian and the main force of 9,000 men, will advance from the moat toward Dunfort and then on to Goldgrass. The second force, Lord Spar's corps, reinforced to 4,000, is to take the lesser castle of Browngrass, at the mouth of the Greengrass Valley, and advance west. The 2 forces will link up at the first opportunity before advancing to confront Jon Stark. Lastly, Jainier Tawny, with 2,000 men from the moat's garrison, will launch a strong sortie to keep northern forces tied down on another front and seek to obtain supplies from the northern countryside near Witford. The situation is different for John. The northern general has received very few reinforcements, most have once again been diverted to aid in the riverlands, and his exhausted army, numbering barely 8,000 men, is beginning to lack equipment and will be heavily outnumbered by the Ironborn on every possible front. Victorian begins his advance on the 5th day of the 7th moon. The next day, the skies froze over, soaking the troops, icing the rivers, and reducing the roads to deep layers of snow. Faced with this blessing of weather, John is content to watch the enemy struggle forward through the blizzards, knowing the effort will exhaust their infantry and that some will fall ill, consuming the Ironborn's already scarce supplies. On the 7th day, fighting breaks out east of Browngrass, where John has placed a detachment of 2,000 men under the command of Sir Roderick to watch the valley road, attack any Ironborn force, and keep them contained. Sir Roderick executes this containment tactic masterfully, but he is heavily outnumbered, and his attacks prove ineffective with the arrival of the bulk of Spar's troops. Castle begins to fall back toward Brown Castle while Mira abandons Dunfort without a fight and withdraws in the direction of Goldgrass, leaving the land barren for the invader. The White Wolf has yielded one castle and lost another, but in exchange for ground, Victorian's advance has been stretched too thin. Slowed by the heavy snow, the poor physical condition of his recruits, and John's own nature, which does not allow him to remain passive for long, the northern general finds the moment to strike the enemy hard just as the Greyjoy soldiers cross the Fever. By mid-morning, John orders Mira to attack Denys Fairwind's vanguard in the village of Dunfort while Cleesewin and the northern cavalry flank Vormark's column and threaten the bridgehead at Dunfort Castle. The northerners launch dozens of separate assaults, but despite their poor overall discipline, the Ironborn recruits hold firm and fight fiercely against the riders and men of the north. With 462 killed and 54 horsemen lost in the skirmish, the Battle of Dunfort becomes the bloodiest day of the campaign so far, and a tactical failure for John, who is left stalled before the Ironborn defense on the high ground. Hours later, he receives troubling news from Sir Roderick. During the fierce fighting at Browngrass, some Ironborn nearly slipped behind the northern lines, almost causing a rout and threatening their line of retreat, forcing the old knight to withdraw while fighting his way back to the village of Timbergrass in the Greengrass Valley under constant pressure from Spar. By the time Sir Roderick reaches Timbergrass, the knight has lost nearly a third of his command among the dead, wounded, and missing, while Spar has achieved a critical victory, but at a high cost, almost a quarter of his forces. The odds remain against the north, and with 1,200 facing 3,000, the ratio is now even worse, slightly above 2 to 1. The northerners are retreating on all fronts, and unless John manages to devise something extraordinary, everything indicates that he is destined to suffer a major strategic defeat and that the moat will once again be out of northern hands. Soldiers, I am displeased with your performance. It only took a handful of squids to scare the bolts of the north from a battle we were winning. This is not the conduct of true brave northerners. Sir Roderick Castle to his command, 8th 7 Moon, 299. John's position is dangerous, but the caution of his enemies in the pursuit grants him a respite to recover from the initial defeats. For 6 full days, Spar and Victorian coordinate their next movements with astonishing slowness. It is not a situation John would have tolerated had the case been reversed. When the Ironborn finally advance, they do so clumsily and in a disorganized manner, to the point that Fairwind and the vanguard approach Goldgrass to investigate reports of a northern withdrawal without realizing they are far from the rest of the army. The isolated column of 3,000 men is too great a temptation for John to ignore, so he orders Sewin and Mira to attack Fairwind by surprise and redirects the regiments of Asher Forrester and Fisher Brenneat. The northerners surprise the Ironborn near Gramey and inflict 500 casualties, but Fairwind and the rest manage to escape toward a ridge near the village, where they hold through the afternoon and make camp for the night. The following day, John resumes the attack, knowing he has a chance to annihilate nearly a third of Victorian's men, but the conditions of the terrain are atrocious. The northerners struggled to advance uphill through the light snowfall and the strong wind of that morning, their boots slipping on the stones as the Ironborn entrenched atop the ridge loosed arrows and bolts upon them. Near midday, Forrester and his infantry regiment finally managed to reach the crest, and it seems the Starks might be able to drive the Greyjoys from their position and annihilate the enemy column when Fisher's regiment succeeds in turning the Ironborn flank. But just as John Stark considers that victory is near, the drums to the east reveal the arrival of the Greyjoy army. John has miscalculated, Victorian has arrived sooner than expected. The Greyjoy troops come to support Fairwind's harried column at the critical moment and manage to stabilize the line. The Northerners now run the risk of being flanked from both sides, and with their forces worn down by the march and the battle, they adopt new defensive positions and hold the line until nightfall, when Jon decides to limit his losses and orders the withdrawal toward Goldgrass. It has been an unequivocal tactical defeat for the North, Jon's first in battle. Grey Marsh casualty. Starks. Killed and wounded, 870. Prisoners, 330. Greyjoy. Killed and wounded, 762. Prisoners, 238. The following day, Jon writes furiously to the king and the Northern War Council in Riverrun. The White Wolf has no doubt whatsoever that they are responsible for his defeat, for having repeatedly failed to send him reinforcements and for pressing him to go on the offensive against a numerically superior enemy. We may be on the verge of losing the North. None of the expected aid has arrived. The army of Winterfell, reduced to a handful of men, is exhausted by the pressure you have placed upon it. The heroes of Tumbleown, Blackpool, and Salt Spear have died for their country or lie in hospitals, wavering between life and death. The men have nothing left but their conviction and their pride. You have abandoned us in the depths of the swamps of the Neck. But, despite his seemingly desperate situation, Jon was devising a plan to counterattack. A bold and astonishing gamble that would inspire one of the greatest legends of the White Wolf. In a few days, we will try one last effort. If the gods smile at us, the moat will be taken, and with it, the victory. Jon Stark to Robb Stark, 15th 7 Moon, 299. With the Ironborn converging on Goldgrass, Jon decides to risk everything in a bold and reckless maneuver. Leaving Sewin to cover Goldgrass, the White Wolf will circle south with the rest of the army, cross the Fever, and then turn north, threatening to cut Victorion's line of communications and capture his baggage and supply train. Such losses would doom Victorion's entire army, even if he managed to win a tactical victory over the Starks. Marching through the night, Mira and Asher Forrester manage to reach the village of Tam undetected and cross the Fever by the local bridge at the river's headwaters before beginning their advance north toward the river's main channel. Mira's men cross the river over a wooden bridge and continue their advance, but with marshlands on both sides, they must remain on the narrow, raised causeway, barely 10 meters wide, to move safely and in good order. The Northerners reach Chel, where they must cross another bridge to continue north, and find it defended by 2,000 drowned men, the Ironborn elite infantry. The Ironborn are not known for discipline and battlefield cohesion, but the drowned men are something different, heavily armored and armed with crossbows and spears. The bridge becomes a completely impassable bottleneck. Horribly exposed to projectile fire, the northern troops take shelter behind the reverse slope of the ground. Reinforcements are sent, but they too are pinned down by the constant fire of bows and crossbows from the opposite bank, less than 100 meters away. The northern captains begin to grow desperate and make mistakes. Brenneat Fisher had discharged himself from the hospital that very morning so as not to miss the battle and attempted to lead an infantry charge to break the deadlock, but he was struck in the leg by a bolt that put him out of action. The fiery Mira refuses to accept defeat and orders another attack, but her men are exhausted and demoralized. With 3 captains wounded, the assault at Chel has come to a complete standstill. By midday, Victorion hears the sound of drums and war horns from the south. He assumes the Northerners are making a feint to distract him from his planned attack on Goldgrass, but soon, alarming news reaches him. Stark has crossed the tributary with considerable forces and now stands behind his left flank on the Fever. Reacting swiftly to the situation, the Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet orders 2,000 men to attack the Stark left wing and diverts Vormark's rearguard, some 1,000 strong, to reinforce Chel directly. From the rear, Jon grows increasingly concerned about the stalemate at Chel. If the North cannot break through the defenses, Victorion will have more than enough time to reposition and deny him any advance over the Fever. Fearing the arrival of enemy forces, the Stark general orders Forrester's column to move northwest to protect the flank of the advance, but Asher's vanguard collides with the Ironborn in the village of Glaviers, where the fighting bogs down. At first, the Ironborn have the advantage, but a disastrous incident of crossbow-friendly fire sparks panic, and Asher manages to push them uphill along the causeway. The northern general rides to Chel to try to revive the attack, but finds hundreds of northern soldiers taking shelter behind the causeway, reluctant to face the Ironborn fire. Moira takes up a direwolf banner and begins to advance. "Soldiers of the north," she shouts. "Come and claim your banner." In truth, none dared to follow her. Seeing that the army would not move, the commander of the northern army himself draws his Valyrian steel sword, takes a banner, and runs forward. A devastating rain of arrows falls around him. Several men are wounded, and his guards, Karlon and Rickon Karstark, are killed by bolts that strike them in the neck. Another of his guards, Yoren Bol, would later recall, "The soldiers saw him, and none imitated him. I witnessed this extraordinary cowardice, and I cannot comprehend it." With the northern infantry refusing to follow their officers, the assault on the bridge ends in total failure. A poorly coordinated Ironborn counterattack fails to push the Starks off the causeway, but in the confusion of the skirmish, Jon's horse loses its footing, and Stark falls into the marsh and has to be pulled out by his guards. That afternoon, the battle ended with the Forester column repelling the Greyjoy counteroffensive and inflicting heavy casualties before finally securing Chel. Even so, that night, Asher's men are ordered to withdraw. Jon is preparing to fall back. If, as the northerner expects, Spar has continued his advance through the Greengrass Valley, Jon must retreat now or face encirclement by his forces, but at the hour of the wolf, the general receives a report that changes everything. Not only is Sir Roderick still holding his position, but he has not even been attacked yet. Jon's line of retreat remains secure for at least a few more days. Jon is debating the options with his officers when a column of reinforcements finally arrives. 1,000 men, sent by Howland Reed, Lord of the Neck, and some provisions are all that the soldiers' morale and the general's confidence need. At once, Jon cancels the withdrawal and gives orders to attack the next day. The Battle of Chel. Day 2. Jon has lost the element of surprise, and Victorian is already planning his counterattack. During the night, his troops advance little by little, Saltcliffe toward Portsile, Vormark back toward Chel. Both armies are on the move before dawn. Moira sends her father's elite skirmishers into the marshes. When the Greyjoy forces arrive bunched up on the causeway, they become easy targets for northern archers and crossbowmen. After a hard fight, in which an Ironborn captain is killed, Moira's men manage to drive them back. However, Forester cannot approach Chel. Greyjoy archers and crossbowmen on the far side of the fever still sweep the causeway with arrows and bolts. Jon orders his men to cross downstream, at Sunk Grove, but the Ironborn have already posted guards at the crossing point, and the northerners' attempts to get across the river by floating or swimming fail. Something that surprises Jon occurs as the sun casts its last rays over the battlefield. Jon's stable boy is found dead on the bank of a nearby river close to the camp. With no visible wounds on the body and completely soaked, Samwell concludes, he must have drowned in an accident. With the battle occupying everyone's minds, the incident is dismissed as an unfortunate tragedy, though, in haste, a small puncture in the neck goes unnoticed, and the boy's satchel is missing. The second day of the battle ends in a stalemate. Many soldiers must sleep among the marshes and eat and rest as best they can, while the wounded are evacuated in carts pulled by horses specially assigned to this task for the first time in the entire war. General Stark will try once more to break through, but time is running out. The Battle of Chel. Day 3. Spar, who by then has already received several urgent requests from Victorian to advance, finally attacks on the 16th day of the 7th moon. Sir Roderick, despite being outnumbered, manages to make the Ironborn pay in blood for every inch of ground they take. But after hours of close fighting, in which Sir Roderick himself is nearly captured, the northerner is forced to carry out a slow fighting withdrawal toward Goldgrass. Lord Spar takes Greengrass and captures around 200 prisoners. With Spar finally on the move, Jon must force a resolution at Chel or retreat. The bridge at Chel has proven too difficult to break, so Jon decides to change tactics. Asher's forces will cross the fever and attack Chel from the south with their full strength. To support his captain, Jon sends a column on a night march to flank and cross the river some 5 kilometers farther south, at Grenz, with orders to then move quickly up along the eastern bank to support him. Meanwhile, Moira will advance along the causeway in support while protecting the left flank of the northern advance. During the night, some men from Asher's forces manage to swim across the fever, but at dawn, the Ironborn detect the maneuver and launch an attack on the bridgehead with barrels that damage the support posts of the northern bridges. With the bridges disabled and delays during the night, only a third of the force has managed to cross, yet it still begins a bold advance toward Chel. To add to the setbacks, the supporting advance under Moira is delayed when the bridge collapses, and to worsen the crisis, the Greyjoys launch an attack against the fragile northern foothold on the far side of the tributary. This time, Jon has a plan prepared. With all available crossbowmen and archers waiting until about 80 paces, the Northerners fire coordinated volleys that shatter the Ironborn charge, forcing them to fall back under a devastating and constant rain of projectiles at close range. Under the cover of their archers and crossbowmen, the bridges are quickly repaired, but when the Northerners advance, they encounter fierce opposition on both sides of the fever. A bloody back-and-forth battle breaks out along the causeways, as neither side can fully deploy its troops or gain a clear advantage. Yet the superior armor and weaponry of the Northerners begin to take their toll on the Ironborn, who, despite outnumbering their enemies, are suffering heavy losses in close combat. Around 2 hours after midday, the northern column coming from Grenz arrives, threatening to envelop the Greyjoy flank. Just as the defense of Chel seems about to collapse, the Greyjoys launch a chaotic attack on the bridge, catching the Northerners on the opposite causeway by surprise. Captain Roose Roswell is killed in the Islanders' maneuver, and his troops fall back in disorder. Panic begins to spread until Forrester charges with his escort, raising the morale of the troops on the eastern bank. Nevertheless, his actions abruptly halt the counter-attack in that sector and help stabilize the northern line. The moment of truth has arrived. The Ironborn counter-attack has been made possible by Victorion's last reserves. The Lord Captain had expected that the North had already committed all its forces and that this assault would break an overextended northern army, but he had miscalculated. Jon Stark can still rely on Moira's uncommitted troops, including the elite Cranogmen skirmishers. At the call of the Northern Warhorns, their sudden counter-attack changes the course of the battle. Moira's men advance along the causeway, capturing dozens of prisoners. Forrester's forces break the right flank and cut off the escape route of 2 enemy columns by seizing the bridge at Chel, though the village itself remains contested. At midday, when Jon sees the defeated enemy abandoning Chel, he organizes a charge with the little cavalry he has. The panic unleashed is widespread and ends with hundreds of Ironborn dead or captured. Victorion, seeing that victory is no longer possible, orders his exhausted and demoralized men to withdraw. The Ironborn general falls back toward Dunfort to protect his lines of communication. The Battle of Chel has lasted 3 days and has been a chaotic and bloody struggle for both sides, with no major tactical maneuvers until the end. Jon Stark's impression is that the margin of victory has been narrow, as nearly a quarter of his army is reported as casualties. After interrogating the prisoners and counting the dead on the field, the northern general can proclaim the victory loud and clear. For now, they have done enough, inflicting nearly 3 times as many casualties on their enemy. Chel casualties. Stark. Killed and wounded, 1,687. Prisoners, 313. Greyjoy. Killed and wounded, 2,163. Prisoners, 3,337. It took good luck to defeat Victorion. Jon Stark to Samwell Tarly. Victorion may be retreating, but Spa remains a threat. The next day, Jon sets out at his usual pace. He sends Asher to reinforce Sir Roderick's position, while Brenneat takes a different route to cut off the Ironborn's line of retreat. The lack of communication between Spa and Victorion borders on the absurd. Victorion writes to his column commander informing him that he must withdraw as soon as possible. But Spa does not believe the news of the disaster that has engulfed Victorion's army, nor that the wolves are now gathering against him, and he continues advancing toward Goldgrass. It is not until he finds himself directly threatened by the combined forces of Asher and Sir Roderick that he decides to withdraw, but by then it is already too late. Brenneat has taken the castle of Greengrass and threatens to block the Ironborn army's only escape route. Spa's only option is to carry out a fighting withdrawal while being pressed from all sides. By the time he manages to regroup at Browngrass, he has lost 3/4 of his original command. The result is that both Greyjoy armies have been decimated and are in retreat. And with exquisitely poor timing, Tawny chooses that very moment to launch his attack on Witford. He at least manages to secure some much-needed supplies, at the cost of 300 casualties. It has been a harsh but ultimately victorious campaign for Jon. He has suffered his first defeat in battle and won a disorderly war of attrition at Chel, yet he has triumphed against all odds and dealt another potentially fatal blow to the enemy. What is more, his heroic stand on the bridge at Chel will soon take on a life of its own throughout Westeros. Artists and bards turn a slightly embellished version of the events into a sensational piece of propaganda that captivates the small folk of the north and spreads far beyond its borders. Even without Jon actively seeking glory, Westeros is witnessing the birth of the legends of the White Wolf, a powerful force that will inspire loyalty and devotion among the northern people for many years. For now, both armies settle into a tense truce as the seventh moon comes to an end. At Moat Cailin, the Ironborn are nearing their limit. Hunger looms over them, though Victorian is determined to endure to the very end. The Ironborn will have one last chance to capture Goldgrass, a final offensive to decide the outcome of the war in the north. Notes. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Feel free to make any theory you have on the comments. I know that is not the traditional writing style, so please tell me what do you think. This is my first work, also English is not my main language. So, if you see any mistake please tell me. If you have any constructive criticism or comments feel free to put it in the comment section. Chapter updated at the 5th of February, 2026. Chapter 5, The Battle of Witford. Summary. Excerpt from Chapter 2 of the book The Death of Nobilism in Westeros by the Pentoshi historian Marius Lockhart. As we have already seen in the first chapter of the book, nobilism in Westeros did not die from one day to the next, it was a slow process of gradual decline. The original cause and the beginning of its decline are still a matter of debate, but what cannot be denied is that the War of the Five Kings was the clear moment when nobilism was sentenced to death, slowly, but to death nonetheless. The region where there is the greatest consensus among historians is the North. Historians argue that nobilism in the North began its decline coincidentally with the end of Jon Stark's first campaign and the Battle of Witford, in addition to the subsequent discussion at Moat Cailin, where the northern high nobility, represented by Howland Reed, and Jon Stark fractured their relations at the most critical moment of the War of the Five Kings. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 8th Moon, 299. A new moon rises, yet the same objectives and burdens remain for the bastard general as he continues the campaign against the last Greyjoy field army in the north. The remnants of the Ironborn have been driven into retreat and, after the messy victory at Chel, forced back toward Moat Cailin. But the northern army is in a poor state. Reinforcements and supplies from Winterfell have yet to arrive through the Blue Hills, and both the Ryswells and the Dustins have proven less cooperative than Jon had expected, even though the fighting took place in the latter's lands. The situation is approaching a breaking point. Uniforms and armor are falling apart, shoes and boots are worn to tatters, and for the first time, the northern host is going hungry. Meanwhile, the army's chief of logistics, Samwell Tarly, struggles desperately to secure enough provisions to sustain them. One of the greatest concerns shared by Jon and Samwell is the wretched state of medical care within the army. Having witnessed the carnage of his first battles, General Jon Stark is horrified by the sight of wounded soldiers dying for lack of treatment and by the absence of any proper system to recover the injured from the battlefield. I cannot believe the state of neglect our wounded suffer. Soldiers are left on the battlefield or lying on the ground for hours, even days. The medics and nurses lack the most basic supplies needed to save lives. War is a ruthless path, yet it shocks me to think that, for 10,000 years in Westeros, lords and maesters have so neglected the care of wounded common soldiers, the very backbone of every army. Jon Stark to Samwell Tarly. This is not only a matter of returning men to service. The medical situation weighs heavily on morale. Soldiers fight with greater confidence and fierceness when they know they will not be left to bleed to death if wounded. Since the Battle of Blackpool, Jon and his captains have tried to address this, having seen how many northern wounded went untreated after the brutal fighting there. Chel stands as a grim example of how casualties continue to mount after the battle itself. In the marshlands, wounds quickly become infected, and among the Ironborn, deaths from disease surpassed those from combat. Northern losses were severe, 1,687 soldiers killed or wounded, including 381 slain outright. That left 1,306 injured men stranded in one of the harshest regions of the north. As the battle dragged on for days, the wounded were often pushed aside in the chaos of fighting. Yet there have been signs of progress. Even before Salt Spear, General Stark had begun organizing a permanent and dedicated medical corps, drawing in maesters, nurses, midwives, healers, and assistants from across the north. Though still in its early stages, this effort has already proven its worth. Deaths resulting from the lack of rapid care dropped to 174 cases. In total, only 218 of the wounded died in the days following the battle, an important milestone for Jon, and one received with deep gratitude by the soldiers. Conditions are far worse for the Greyjoy host at Moat Cailin, commanded by Lord Captain Victorian Greyjoy. In just 2 months, nearly 1,500 men have died from disease, untreated wounds, or the brutal climate. For the first time, numbers have become a pressing problem for Greyjoy. Of the 15,000 men who once marched south, only 7,000 remain, and food grows scarcer by the day. The survivors subsist on horse meat and whatever scraps of grain or forage they can find. Even these meager rations will be exhausted by the 22nd day of the 8th moon, barely 3 weeks away. Time is running out for Victorian. The Ironborn must seize a supply depot and resupply themselves before that day, or they will run out of food, and with it, any hope of escaping the north. The enemy is on their last leg. Hold a little bit longer, brother, the mission you asked me for will be completed sooner than you expect. Jon Stark to Robb Stark, 1st of the 8th moon, 299. Jon, having received barely 1,000 reinforcements, prepares to meet Victorian's advance with just 5,000 men. Once again, he will be outnumbered, and worse still, he has no certainty where Victorian intends to strike. A full 1,000 soldiers must remain at Goldgrass to guard the vital artery of his supply route. With his numbers so limited, Jon chose caution and decided to wait, knowing he could not defend 2 positions at once. But 2 days later, troubling news reaches him from the Riverlands. The war is no longer turning in the North's favor. At the Battle of Duskendale, 1/3 of their infantry was lost to the newly formed Reach Iron Throne Alliance, and Stannis Baratheon's defeat at the Blackwater has left the Lannisters firmly in the ascendant. Worse still, Princess Myrcilla's betrothal to Tristan Martell all but guarantees Dorne's entry into the war against them, and whispers of treason continue to grow louder. Pressed by urgency and by Robb's counsel to reclaim Moat Cailin, Jon resumes his advance on the 3rd day of the 8th moon. As his army moves toward the narrow passage of the Greengrass Valley, he braces for the familiar stubborn resistance of the Ironborn. Yet the front remains eerily silent. After 2 days of marching, on the 5th, the northern host retakes Browngrass Castle without a fight. The White Wolf is left bemused. The fortress lies in ruins. Its armory and workshops have been burned and smashed, but the abandonment of such a strategic stronghold at the mouth of the Greengrass Valley is something Jon cannot easily understand. The explanation comes from the few survivors left behind. They report that the Ironborn withdrew in haste, sacking every farm and village along their path, taking food, horses, and any supplies they could carry. Plunder was nothing new, but the focus on provisions was unexpected. The Ironborn, who usually prized gold and captives above all else, had turned their attention almost entirely to food. It spoke of desperation, and of the dire straits Victorian's forces had reached. For Jon and his staff, the revelation comes as a shock. They had expected the Ironborn to make their last stand here, buying time to entrench themselves at Moat Cailin. Instead, it is clear that they are already out of time. At last, the full effect of Jon's hard-fought and chaotic victory at Chel becomes evident. The scale of the disaster that has engulfed Victorian's army fills the northern general with a growing certainty. The moat, and final victory, are now within reach. Victorian has left a garrison of 500 men at Moat Cailin under the command of Tawny. With the remaining 4,500, he has pushed north toward Witford, hoping to seize the castle that serves as the northern army's supply depot in the region. But heavy snow, the lack of horses, and dwindling provisions have slowed his advance to a crawl. By the 5th, he had covered only 30 of the 45 kilometers that separate Moat Cailin from Witford. A single day's march still lies between him and the supplies he so desperately needs. But the Ironborn have run out of time. As they break camp, movement stirs on their left flank. A column of men begins to descend onto the plateau, the direwolf banner flying proudly above their heads. Jon chose to press forward. As his army emerged from the valley, now scarcely 30 kilometers from the northern walls of Moat Cailin, he caught sight of his final objective. From a hill that dominated the landscape, the great fortress rose in the distance, the same stronghold where the hungry wolf, Theon Stark, and later his namesake Jon Stark had halted the Andal invasions centuries before. Lowering his gaze to the Witford plateau below, Jon saw movement. The Greyjoy host was on the march. Both sides were stunned by the sudden encounter. Orders rang out as each army hastily formed its battle lines. Their numbers were nearly equal, around 4,500 men apiece, but Victorian knew well that the discipline of the Northern Army would give them the advantage in close combat. Rather than risk an immediate clash, he took the defensive, positioning his forces on the high ground of the plateau. As they waited for the Northerners to make the first move, Victorian sent word, calling Jon to a parley. The meeting was set for 2 hours before sunset, in the middle of no man's land, with no more than 20 bodyguards allowed on either side. Both commanders honored the terms. For the first time in the campaign, Jon and Victorian came personally. Mounted on their horses, they saluted each other with solemn respect. Stark the Greyjoy said, bowing his head in a curt, respectful nod. Greyjoy the Northern general replied, returning the gesture. I must admit, I'm surprised you called for a meeting. Negotiation is not something your people are known for. Spare me the irony, Stark. I'm here to negotiate an end to the hostilities. For a moment, Jon could only stare at him in disbelief. Then he let out a sharp laugh. You. He laughed again, coughing as he caught his breath. You come to ask for a ceasefire. After sacking and invading our lands, you expect to bargain. The only negotiation you'll have is the one that ends with Pike burned to the ground. We can end this here and now, Victorian replied, his voice steady. Balon has abandoned us. There is no need, nor any will among my men, to keep fighting a pointless battle. He was about to continue when Jon abruptly cut him off. If there's truly no need to keep fighting, then surrender. I give you my word, the lives of you and your men will be spared. I'll even give you the option of taking the Black. He held Victorian's gaze. You wanted to negotiate. These are my terms, unconditional surrender. You know I can't accept that, Victorian said, letting out a long breath. My men may be desperate, but they will not yield without a fight. He paused, then met Jon's eyes again. Here is my offer. Grant us safe passage to the coast and let us leave. In return, the Iron Islands will pay 2 million gold dragons in compensation for the invasion, and 2 million more for the gradual return of the captured nobles. An uneasy silence fell between them. At last, Jon spoke. We both know neither you nor I has the authority to make such an agreement. The Northern Marshal drew a slow breath. Besides, your king wants my people dead or enslaved, and mine has ordered me to drive every invader from our soil. He paused, then added more quietly, consider my offer, Lord Captain. The only thing I can grant you is a truce until dawn tomorrow. Jon extended his hand. Victorian's mouth twisted into a brief, wry smile. He clasped the offered hand firmly and said, Farewell, General Stark. The parley had proven pointless. Both commanders returned to their camps and began preparing for battle at first light. Jon understood all too well that a cornered enemy is the most dangerous kind. Men with nothing left to lose fight with a desperation that can turn the tide of any engagement. Yet he intended to use that very desperation against them. As at Tumbleown, Jon planned to lure the Ironborn into striking what appeared to be a vulnerable point. He would create the illusion of a weak spot in the northern line, a tempting breach meant to draw Victorian's men forward. Counting on their urgency and hunger for escape, Jon knew they would throw their strength at that single point. The northern line would yield slowly and deliberately, giving ground just enough to suggest that an Ironborn breakthrough, and perhaps victory, was within reach. And when Victorian committed his final reserves, when his men were exhausted from fighting uphill and pressing the attack, Jon would strike. His cavalry and light infantry would sweep in from the flanks, trapping the Ironborn and shattering their formation, denying them any chance of escape. To carry out the plan, Jon divided his army into 3 groups. The first contingent, some 1,500 strong, would form the front line under Sir Roderick's command. The mountains would secure their left flank while their right flank would rest on a series of narrow passes guarded by Forrester and 500 elite pikesmen. The second group, composed of Mira's seasoned light infantry and the crossbowmen, would support the front line. Their task was to reinforce Sir Roderick where the Ironborn pressed hardest and to hold the line long enough for the trap to take shape. The third and final force consisted of Jon's elite cavalry and the Cranogmen skirmishers. They would remain hidden and in reserve, waiting for the moment when the Ironborn were fully committed. Then, at the decisive instant, they would sweep in from the flanks, turning the tide in a single, crushing maneuver and destroying the last Greyjoy field army. Meanwhile, Victorian gathered his captains and told them of the terms Jon Stark had offered. As expected, the reaction was immediate and furious. The captains raged at the thought of surrender and demanded battle at dawn, eager to teach that little dog the meaning of the Iron Price. Victorian listened in silence, but he could not shake the feeling that this was exactly what Stark had been counting on. "My comrades, Stark asks us for one last favor. Destroy those squids who have dared to disrespect our beloved homeland." Sir Roderick to his detachment, 7th 8 Moon 299. That morning, as both armies formed their battle lines, a light mist clung to the field. Victorian chose to wait. He knew Jon was a dangerous opponent and wanted to gauge the strength of the northern host before committing to an attack. But as the minutes dragged on, his captains grew restless. Their men were anxious, eager to strike, and discipline began to fray. After nearly 2 hours of tense silence, a horn suddenly sounded. Without waiting for orders, the right flank of the Ironborn army began to advance uphill toward the northerners. Victorian realized at once that there would be no holding them back. With no real choice left, he gave the signal for the rest of the army to follow. It played directly into Jon's hands. As the mist slowly lifted, the full Greyjoy host came into view, climbing the slope to meet the northern line. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained down, the opening exchange of fire favoring the defenders. Then the Ironborn infantry charged, and the Battle of Witford was joined in earnest. For the first hour, the struggle raged without decision. The northern line held firm and, to Victorian's surprise, even began to push the Ironborn back. In response, he committed his remaining infantry reserves, stabilizing the line just as Moira's contingent moved forward to relieve the exhausted northern front. Casualties began to mount. Northern archers and crossbowmen exacted a heavy toll on the disorganized Ironborn right, cutting down men as they struggled to maintain formation on the slope. By midday, Victorian saw his line wavering on the edge of collapse. In desperation, he ordered the few mounted infantry at his disposal to charge uphill against the northern left flank. The assault struck the front line hard, and at last the northerners began to give ground. As the line bent under the pressure, the men in the rear ranks cast anxious looks toward their commander, wondering what he was waiting for, and when he would finally answer the blow. Then we all look in an anxious gaze to General Stark, but after a short inspection, he closed his Mirish telescope and calmly claimed, "They are ours." Samwell Tarly on his memories. Sensing weakness, Victorian seized the moment. Gathering his archers, he pushed forward to support the infantry's advance, determined to break the northern line at last. Jon, however, remained calm. He could see the truth of it, the Ironborn were near exhaustion, and Victorian had just committed his final reserves. As Victorian's men crashed into the northerners on the right flank, the bastard general drew his Valyrian steel sword and raised it high. For the north. At his command, the hidden reserve surged into motion. The northern cavalry, only a few hundred horsemen, burst from concealment and slammed into the exposed right flank of the Ironborn army. The impact was devastating. Under the sudden onslaught, the Ironborn flank collapsed. Jon immediately turned his attention back to the center, where the fighting had grown chaotic and disordered. The unexpected appearance of northern cavalry, supported by fast-moving infantry, sent ripples of panic through the Greyjoy ranks. The final blow came when the main Greyjoy banner was seized and dragged down. What little order remained dissolved into a full rout. Victorian, who moments before might have believed himself on the brink of victory, was forced to turn and flee, joining a desperate race to the rear that only deepened the chaos among his men. Through tenacity, discipline, and careful planning, the Northern Army had transformed a favorable situation into a decisive triumph. Their own casualties were light, while the Ironborn were shattered. Witford casualties. North. Killed and wounded 600. Prisoners 100. Greyjoy. Killed and wounded 1,500. Prisoners 2,500. John led the mopping up operations personally. In the end, barely 100 Ironborn managed to escape the slaughter and retreat to Moat Cailin, Victorian among them. 3 days later, on the 10th day of the 8th moon, John arrived before the fortress with an army at the height of its confidence, fresh from victory. Inside the crumbling stronghold, Victorian and Tawny both knew the truth: there would be no victory here. Their supplies were nearly gone, their men exhausted, and relief would never come. Yet Victorian still sought a warrior's end. Though wounded, he challenged Jon Stark to single combat, a final act of defiance. Something that Jon Stark accepted. The duel was fought in no man's land between the two armies. Victorian's axe swung with terrible force, each blow aimed at Jon's head. In the opening moments, the Ironborn commander seemed to have the advantage, pressing the attack with the strength and ferocity that had made his name feared across the seas. But as the duel wore on, his wounds and his age began to betray him. To the soldiers watching in tense silence, the fight seemed to last an eternity. In truth, it was over in barely 4 minutes. In the end, the White Wolf stood victorious. Jon gave Victorian the mercy of a clean death, ending his suffering where he lay. A roar rose from the northern ranks, their general's name carried across the field. With each victory, Jon's reputation as both a brilliant tactician and a formidable swordsman grew. At midday on the 14th day of the 8th moon, after the fortress had been secured, the last Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet was buried with full honors. Even his enemies paid respect, and his surviving men mourned the loss of their commander. Still, Tawny refused to yield. Hoping for some final, personal triumph, he held the moat for 2 more weeks. But with their food exhausted and no hope left, resistance became meaningless. On the morning of the 28th, Tawny and the last of the Ironborn laid down their arms and surrendered to Jon. After 6 moons of war, the Ironborn invasion of the north was finally over. It was a victory that would be celebrated across the north. Yet it was Sir Roderick Castle who accepted the formal surrender, for Jon had already turned his gaze southward, toward the next enemy he would have to face, Ramsay Snow. Kith truly run war guardian ara war gran, Heath Wolf. You are truly the guardian of the people, White Wolf. Rickon Stark to Jon Stark. From the dread fort, its castellan, Ramsay Snow, had begun to impose a brutal reign of terror upon the surrounding lands. He had forced Lady Donella Mondaly into marriage to strengthen his claim, and, as if that were not enough, he had sent a threatening letter to Coldstream, the seat of House Poole, demanding privileges and the disputed borderlands that the two houses had contested for more than half a century. Jon answered in the only way he knew how. With 4,000 men at his back, he marched north to show the bastard the justice of House Stark. At the Ethering, Asher Forrester's column swept aside a Bolton force 1,000 strong, scattering them with ease. Ethers Fort was taken without a fight. Yet something about it unsettled Jon. The presence of that Bolton column made little sense. Those men should have been in the Riverlands. As he pondered the matter, Sam came running into the hall with letters recovered from the castle. What they revealed was worse than he had feared. The whispers and rumors were true. Roose Bolton was plotting treachery against the Starks, against Robb in particular. Jon immediately sent a raven south, hoping Robb was still at Riverrun and might yet be warned. Then, without delay, he marched to confront the remaining Bolton forces, reported to be encamped near Weeping Town. Jon drove his men hard through the night. At dawn, they reached the plain where the enemy camp lay. There was no warning, no parley. Jon gave a single, cold order: attack, and show no mercy to those who bore arms. The assault was swift and brutal, the camp taken in chaos and blood. Many of Ramsay's companions were still asleep after a night of drinking and tormenting some poor girl when the northern soldiers stormed their tents. One by one, the leaders of the force were seized and dragged outside. Confusion spread among the captives. One man, filthy and wild-eyed, loudly claimed to be Ramsay Snow, boasting of his crimes and of what he would yet do to the Starks. But Jon's orders were precise. Every man from the commander's tent, he had said. Every captain and every traitor. Bring them before me without exception. 9 men were secured and marched before him. Hey, wolf cunt. I'm the one you're looking for, shouted the man who claimed to be Ramsay. Jon did not react. Instead, he calmly gestured to an older man among the prisoners. Your name? The man looked at him with hollow, lifeless eyes. Ben Bones. Jon nodded and moved down the line. Your name? Yellow Dick. Damon. Luton. Sour Allen. Skinner. Grunt. Each answered in turn. At last, he stopped before the final captive. And yours? The man lowered his gaze. Reek, sir. I want to take the black. At once, several of the others began to echo him, voices rising in desperate chorus. Jon was silent for a moment. Then he gave a slow, almost regretful nod. I'm afraid that won't be possible, gentlemen. He paused before continuing, his voice steady and cold. Taking the black is a mercy offered to common criminals. You are not common criminals. You are traitors. And treason is punished only by death. Jon inclined his head toward the guards, who began to escort the struggling prisoners away. Moments later, Jon stepped forward before the assembled northern soldiers and addressed them as the prisoners were dragged in front of war. Today, you have done more than win a battle. You have crushed a coward's attempt by the Boltons to seize Winterfell and the north. Before you stand the ringleaders of this treachery, a pack of oath-breakers without honor or loyalty. He let his gaze sweep across the ranks. Feel no remorse for what was done here. You have not slain your northern brothers. You have purged traitors who would have sold the north, its people, and its future to the bastard who sits on the Iron Throne, as if we were nothing more than chattel to the whims of the South. Jon turned his gaze toward the prisoners. In the name of Robb Stark, King in the North, Lord of Winterfell and Protector of the Realm, under the proven charge of treason against the Crown of the North, I, Jon Stark, General of the Northern Army, sentence you all to death. He had chosen a new method of execution. 50 crossbowmen formed into 2 lines. 7 of the prisoners were lined up before a stone wall. At the White Wolf's signal, the men loosed their bolts in unison. The bodies crumpled where they stood prior to a soldier going and giving the mercy of death to end their suffering after 30 seconds of bleeding out. It was to be known as the Bolt Squadron, a shameful end reserved for the lowest of the low. Only 2 prisoners remained, Reek and Ramsay Bolton. For them, Jon had chosen something older, harsher, an execution meant as a warning to all who would betray the North. They would die by the ancient First Men's punishment, the Blood Eagle. Bound to a tree, the 2 tormentors of countless innocents were left to face a slow, agonizing end, their suffering stretched over long hours before their hearts finally ceased to beat. The next day, the garrison of the Dread Fort surrendered without resistance. Jon entered the ancient seat of his family's rivals, but what he found within was worse than anything he had seen at Ethos Fort. Dozens of letters lay hidden in the chambers, correspondence between Lord Roose Bolton and his co-conspirators. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. Lord Lud Whitehill of High Point. Lord Roderick Riswell of the Rills. Lady Barbary Dustin of the Barrowlands. And worse still, among the letters was mention of a plot to murder his brother Robb at the wedding of Edmure Tully and Roslyn Frey. Jon immediately left a garrison to hold the Dread Fort and rode south with all haste toward Moat Cailin, sending ravens and riders ahead with warnings. But when he arrived, Sir Roderick was already waiting for him, his face grim with news. On the night of the first day of the 10th moon, at the Twins, by the orders of Tywin Lannister and carried out by Lord Roose Bolton and Lord Walder Frey, the unthinkable had happened. As the musicians played the reigns of Caste Maria, King Robb Stark, his wife Jane Westerling, his mother Lady Catelyn Stark, and nearly all the gathered northern nobility were slaughtered in treachery. The small folk would come to remember it as the Red Wedding. Lord Edmure Tully had been taken captive at the Twins. Only Lady Mage Mormont and Master Galbart Glover had escaped. They brought with them a single document that would change the fate of the North, the will of King Robb Stark. The 2 survivors reached the newly retaken Moat Cailin on the night of the 10th day of the 10th moon. By then, Bran and Rickon had also arrived, grieving and shaken by the deaths of their brother and mother. In the war room of the fortress, Galbart and Mage presented the document to those gathered at the time, Sir Roderick Castle, Moira Reed, Samwell Tully, Bran and Rickon Stark, and their elder half-brother, Jon Stark, and other minor nobles. Jon stepped forward, anxious to open it, determined to honor whatever final wish his brother had left behind. It was a resolve he would soon come to regret. In the document, King Robb Stark formally disinherited Sansa, who had been forced into marriage with Tyrion Lannister, to safeguard the succession over Winterfell. It also confirmed Jon's legitimization in full, granting him rank, titles, and rights of succession. By its terms, if Robb were to die childless, Jon was to be named Lord of Winterfell and the next king in the north. Rather than anger, the news brought relief to Bran and Rickon. Neither had any experience in ruling, nor any desire to bear the weight of a crown while the war still raged. To them, it was their older brother, trusted, proven, and capable, who should carry that burden. For Jon, however, the revelation came as a shock. How could a king pass over his true-born brothers in favor of a legitimized bastard? Yet what unsettled him even more was what followed. Bran and Rickon declared that they would issue a formal statement of abdication, renouncing any claim to Winterfell and the crown. They spoke with quiet certainty, convinced that Jon would win the war and protect both them and the realm. Over the next 2 days, the 11th and 12th of the 10th moon, the rest of the northern nobility began to arrive at Moat Cailin. One by one, they seemed to accept the arrangement. In their presence, Bran and Rickon each signed documents ratifying Robb's decision and openly supporting Jon's coronation as king in the north. But on the evening of the 13th, the last of the great lords still loyal to House Stark arrived. Lord Howland Reed had been delayed by foul weather and the isolation of his seat in the Neck. When at last the will was presented to him, and he read its contents, all expected him to give his assent so that the coronation might proceed. Instead, he raised his head and spoke quietly. "I'm afraid Jon Stark cannot inherit the crown," he said. "Because Jon Stark does not exist." The words struck the room like a blow. Bran was the first to react, his voice breaking with anger. "How can you say such a thing? He may be a legitimized bastard, but he has been more loyal to the north than any true-born lord. And above all, he is my brother. He is my family." "You are right in two things, my lord," Bran Howland replied evenly. "He is indeed your family. But he is not your brother. He is a bastard, but not the bastard of the late Lord Eddard Stark." His gaze moved across the gathered lords and ladies. "I'm afraid that before you stands not Jon Stark, but the son of the two people who plunged all of Westeros into a devastating civil war." A stunned silence fell over the hall. The lords who had come to witness Jon's coronation held their breath, waiting. "He," Howland gestured toward Jon, "is your cousin, my Lord Brandon." Shock rippled through the chamber. Jon himself felt the pieces fall into place even before Howland spoke again. "But not the bastard of your namesake," Reed continued. "He is the result of the crime of Crown Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, who kidnapped and forced himself upon the young Lyanna Stark." Howland raised his arm, his voice rising. "He is the living consequence of that war, the war that cost thousands of lives and took 2 lords of House Stark from this world." Then he looked directly at Jon. "Your uncle loved you as a son. He was the most honorable man I have ever known. So honorable that his greatest dishonor was to protect you, to hide you, and to give you a chance to live. But I will not stand silent while you take the crown under pretenses. The Northern Lords have the right to know who they are naming their king, a Targaryen half-blooded bastard." Jon stood frozen, staring at him. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to the assembled nobles. For days, those same faces had regarded him with admiration and respect. Now he saw shock, unease, disgust, and even fear. Somewhere in the silence, a glass slipped from a hand and shattered against the floor. And then the shouting began. In an instant, the North fractured once more. Excerpt from Chapter 8 of the book Nobilism at War, The Power Struggle and the Politics of the War of the Five Kings by the Mirish historian Dvargil Pilius, written 372 years after the War of the Five Kings. The North, the most apolitical region of Westeros before the war, showed again and again during the conflict that politics had in fact always existed there, but in a form very different from southern politics. In previous chapters, we have already discussed the role Lady Catelyn Stark played in the outbreak of the war and how Tywin Lannister was seeking an excuse for war rather than justice. But now we turn to one of the most controversial episodes of the entire War of the Five Kings, the famed dispute at Moat Cailin, and Lord Howland Reed's entrance into the history that concerns us. Lord Howland Reed is not a minor, forgettable figure, much less a foolish one. He is one of the few lords of the Old Guard, the 2 generations before Jon Stark's, who survived the Red Wedding, and the only lord said to have been close to Lord Eddard Stark, in addition to being the bearer of the truth of Jon Stark's parentage. So, what is the Lord of Greywater Watch accused of? From a modern perspective, he is accused of burning his bridges with Jon Stark, convincing the northern nobility to turn their backs on the would-be king in the north, acting erratically in his decision, and showing no political sense in what would later be agreed upon during the dispute and the Moat Cailin discussion. He is also accused of inconsistency, having guarded the greatest secret in Westeros for the previous 20 years only to reveal it at Moat Cailin in the worst possible manner. The reality is far more interesting if one understands the mindset of the nobles of the late nobility period, and above all, the Northern Society mentality in the year 299 AC, as well as Howland Reed's history before that moment. First, Howland Reed could not have revealed the truth privately to Jon Stark, because by the time the Lord arrived at Moat Cailin, the contents of King Robb Stark's will had already become public knowledge among many Northern lords. Jon Stark also enjoyed a strong military reputation after defeating the Ironborn and retaking Moat Cailin, which earned him the backing of the nobility before Howland's arrival. This, combined with the North's need for strong leadership and a unifying figure, meant that before the revelation, noble support for General Jon Stark to take the Northern crown was high, and that by arriving late, being the last High Lord to get to Moat Cailin, Howland didn't have time either to reveal it to Jon Stark or to scheme with his fellow lords. Second, the secret of Jon Stark's Targaryen blood posed a grave long-term problem for his reign if that information had not been made public, because had it leaked later, it would have destroyed Jon Stark's legitimacy to the Northern throne just as easily as it did when Lord Reed revealed it at Moat Cailin. This shows us that Howland did not convince anyone to oppose Jon Stark, it was Jon Stark's Targaryen blood that changed the nobles' decision. It is often overlooked that the Targaryens had become the North's perpetual enemies as a result of what happened in 282 AC. The abduction of Lyanna Stark, though it is still debated whether it was truly an abduction, the execution of Brandon and Rickard Stark, and above all the grotesque manner of both, ensured that the North would never forgive the Targaryens. These grievances persist to this day, and in Jon Stark's time, only 20 years later, those feelings were common among both the nobility and the small folk of the North, even more so than now. Third, Howland Reed feared, and one could say with reason, that the fire of Targaryen madness, a matter now debated, but at the time considered almost absolute truth, might emerge in Jon Stark, who had already shown himself capable of being ruthless, cold, and willing to use fear to impose his will if he deemed it necessary. Examples often cited include the burning of Ironborn ships with soldiers unwilling to surrender at Salt Spear, his reintroduction of the Blood Eagle, the authoritarian manner in which he conducted the latter part of the campaign against the Ironborn, and his conduct when granted powers to inspect houses suspected of treason against Robb Stark. For all the reasons mentioned above, it is clear that Howland Reed did not act maliciously or with the intention of destroying Jon Stark, however much that may have been the result. Even Howland himself would later acknowledge that his actions were precipitous and carried out in the worst possible way. Rather, he acted as a northerner who saw a half-Targaryen on the verge of sitting on the throne of the North. That is why it made sense that Howland's objective was to prevent Jon Stark from ascending the northern throne. One must remember that the Starks and the kings in the North held broader and more centralized power than the kings of the South. Once crowned, the half-Targaryen would have wielded near absolute authority, backed by the northern army Jon Stark had built during the campaign against the Ironborn. What Howland failed to consider, and the reason he should be absolved of being half-hearted or incoherent regarding the compromise at Moat Cailin, was that the younger generation of nobles had already chosen before the debate even began. The Red Wedding not only destroyed Robb Stark, it also decapitated the old northern nobility, claiming many of its foremost lords and their heirs. In the absence of their fathers and elder brothers, the younger second sons who took command of the various houses were those who had served alongside Jon Stark during the Ironborn campaign. In other words, the conflict was between what remained of the old guard and the young guard, Jon Stark's generation of nobles, at a time when the North was still in shock over what had happened at the Twins. That is why Howland and the old guard accepted the young guard's compromise. Nevertheless, this move by Howland had great consequences in Northern history and highlighted the importance of Jon Stark's campaign at the wall. Yet, as the Pentoshi historian Marius Lockhart has already explored, the most important impact was on Northern nobility and Westerosi nobility in general, and on the lessons Jon Stark would draw from that moment. Notes. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Feel free to make any theory you have on the comments. I know that is not the traditional writing style, so please tell me, what do you think? This is my first work, also English is not my main language. So, if you see any mistake, please tell me. If you have any constructive criticism or comments, feel free to put it in the comment section. Chapter updated at the 7th of February, 2026. Chapter 6, The Voices of History. Summary. Prologue of the third book, The Times of Changes of the Heptalogy of the Ideas and Political Institutions of Westeros by Northern Dornish historian, Maria Curie, 879 years after the War of the Five Kings. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. The White Wolf's first campaign ended with the Battle of Witford and the capitulation of Moat Cailin. It appeared that Jon Stark had secured the north once more and would now march south to reinforce his brother, Robb Stark, so that together they might challenge the southern field armies in a final northern push to win the war. Yet what seemed the triumphant conclusion of a military campaign swiftly gave way to political turmoil. The conspiracy of Roose Bolton came to light when Jon Stark caught Ramsay Snow off guard at the Battle of the Ethering and uncovered the designs behind the Bolton scheme following the surprise attack on Weeping Town. What had been thought a war of banners and battlements revealed itself instead as a struggle of treachery and ambition within the North itself. The Red Wedding marked the beginning of a period of profound change, tension, and reform in the North, and the deliberations at Moat Cailin triggered what many would later consider the beginning of the end of nobilism in Westeros. To understand the next chapter of the White Wolf's legendary life, one must first grasp the forces unleashed in the aftermath of the Red Wedding and the transformations it set into motion. This requires a careful examination of the political, cultural, and social structures of the North, and of Westeros as a whole, during Jon Stark's time, in order to understand the form he would give to the northern institutions and the impact they would have in shaping the age that followed. Excerpt from Chapter 11 of the book, A Continent at War by the historian Cian Rogier of MYR, written 482 years after the War of the Five Kings. With the Frebolton betrayal at the Twins, the northern host in the Riverlands was treacherously annihilated, along with nearly the entirety of the northern high nobility. King Robb Stark perished at the Red Wedding, and with him seemed to vanish the future of his house and of his kingdom. A struggle for power threatened to engulf the North as its two ancient rivals, the Starks and the Boltons, once more contended for dominion over the northernmost and largest of the kingdoms of Westeros. Yet the consequences of Robb Stark's death paled in comparison to the political detonation that proved to be the young wolf's will. In the days before marching to the Twins for the wedding of his uncle, Edmure Tully, King Robb had taken the controversial step of readjusting the line of succession. He did so upon learning of his sister Sansa's marriage to Tyrion Lannister and of the argument advanced by the Faith of the Seven, that, with the remaining Starks devoted to the old gods, only Sansa Stark's claim to Winterfell would be deemed valid in the eyes of the Faith. Robb feared, and not without reason, that the Lannisters might seek to eliminate him and his brothers in order to claim Winterfell through Eddard Stark's eldest daughter. This fear deepened after the wound he sustained during the capture of the Crag, seat of House Westerling, and following 2 attempts upon his life during his return to Riverrun from the Westerlands. Robb Stark's decision to marry Jane Westerling after having dishonored her did little to ease the tense atmosphere following the northern defeat at Duskendale. The reasons why the young wolf lay with Westerling remain fiercely debated to this day. 100 authors have offered 100 explanations, from the reasonable, namely, a moment of weakness and emotional attachment, as Westerling personally tended him during his recovery, to the absurd, such as the theory, advanced shortly after the war, that the Westerlings acted under explicit orders from Lord Tywin Lannister. Whatever his motives, the undeniable fact is that Robb Stark married Jane Westerling. Though honorable by the standards of the age, the decision was harshly criticized by both northern lords and southern allies alike, and many still regard it as the gravest political misstep of his reign. Some historians, particularly among the more recent school, have proposed that Robb suspected that, although Jane herself might be trustworthy, her father, and by extension her family, was not. According to this interpretation, with the northern defeat at Duskendale, the defection of the Freys and Karstarks, and the ever-mounting tensions between the king and his brother Jon Stark, general of the Northern Army campaigning against the Ironborn in the north, the war no longer favored the Starks. This may have led Robb to believe that Lord Westerling might attempt to prove his loyalty to Tywin Lannister by delivering the head of the King of the North. Under such circumstances, Robb may have feared that the Westerlings would once again change cloaks and seek Tywin Lannister's favor by delivering him dead. Yet no conclusive evidence confirms or refutes this theory. What is certain is that, against this fraught backdrop, Robb Stark resolved to dictate his will in anticipation of treacherous elimination. This, in itself, was not extraordinary. Clear succession was customary even in times of uncertainty. The controversy lay in his choice of heir. The king named his bastard brother, Jon Stark, thereby bypassing his true-born brothers, an act nearly unthinkable within the late nobiliary culture of Westeros. The precise reasoning remains uncertain. The prevailing historical consensus suggests that Robb believed the nobility's trust had eroded following his execution of Rickard Karstark, and that, should Bran and Rickon inherit, the Northern Lords might exploit their youth to extract concessions from House Stark, or even supplant it altogether. Thus, Robb Stark appears to have acted pragmatically. In extremity, House Stark, and by extension the North, would require firm leadership capable of preserving both family and realm. At that time, aside from Robb himself, the only Stark respected militarily and feared politically by the northern nobility was Jon. This context renders the deliberations at Moat Cailin of profound importance. Amid near-total northern collapse, the kingdom required leadership that was strong, legitimate, and unifying. Yet Lord Howland Reed's revelation concerning Jon's true lineage deprived him of that unifying character. Nevertheless, Reed's disclosure and the objections of the remaining elder nobles were met coldly by the two other Starks present and by the younger nobles, which surprised the elders, who had not expected personal loyalty to outweigh the cultural trauma of the rebellion. Brandon and Rickon Stark had already declared their intention to abdicate in favor of their cousin even before the will was read. Both trusted Jon deeply, held him in high esteem, and regarded the northern nobility with suspicion. Brandon, in particular, had witnessed how several houses failed to fully support Jon during the campaign against the Ironborn, or submitted petitions seeking privileges, claiming rights to lands, resources, or tax exemptions on grounds Brandon described as utterly arbitrary, convenient, false, or opportunistic. He reportedly condemned such lords as opportunists of the North's misfortune, false northerners without honor. Moreover, Jon Stark was the only one among the surviving brothers who possessed meaningful battle experience. The general was a symbol to the small folk and a deterrent to the more opportunistic nobility. It is recorded that Lord Brandon addressed the assembled lords at Moat Cailin in these words: "The Southerners and the traitors are at our heels and will soon march against us. My cousin is the only one who can sit the throne and command men in battle at the same time. In this hour of urgency, we require both stable governance and a commander capable of rallying and leading our armies. That is only possible if Jon Stark takes the crown." Brandon further argued that even if Robb's will were deemed invalid, particularly in light of information the late king had not known, the high nobility retained the authority to ratify a coronation and that, save for the Mardalis, all major loyal houses were present. This was accurate. Houses Bolton, Karstark, Ryswell, and Dustin had declared treason. Small Jon Umber's subsequent alignment with the Boltons effectively placed House Umber among the traitors as well. The whole fell into a sepulchral silence after Brandon's intervention. Older lords recoiled at the prospect of crowning a man with Targaryen blood, while younger nobles saw in Jon the North's sole viable leader. It was a clash of generations, one already weakened by the Red Wedding, yet still entrenched in title and influence. To break the impasse, Jon proposed what would later be known as the Pact of Moat Cailin. Under its terms, Jon Stark would neither accept nor refuse the crown until a new Great Northern Council could be convened to settle the matter of succession. Recognizing that such a council could only be held in peacetime, it was agreed that, in the interim, Brandon Stark would provisionally assume the title of Stark of Winterfell and serve as Regent of the North, exercising the executive authority traditionally held by the Warden or King in the North in matters of civil governance. Thus the dissenting nobles secured their immediate objective: Jon would not sit the throne. In return for this compromise, Jon's legitimation was ratified. He took the name Stark, and he proposed the creation of a new office, Marshal of the North. This office granted him full authority over military affairs, and it was explicitly stated that it did not confer additional power over civil governance except where sanctioned by the Stark of Winterfell. In practice, the Marshal wielded the military power of a king in the north without the crown itself. However, he was expressly barred from auditing or intervening in non-military matters unless authorized by Winterfell or the Council of Nobles. Yet it was agreed that, in cases of necessity, the Marshal could impose martial law, requisition men and materials, and enact temporary measures to safeguard the realm. This final clause did little to reassure the old guard. Nevertheless, confronted with Jon's support among the younger nobility and satisfied that they had prevented his coronation, Howland Reed, Galbart Glover, and the other elder lords accepted the compromise. In particular, the old guard accepted it as the pact clearly stated that the Marshal of the North was an office, and that office was revocable at any time by the Stark of Winterfell. The nobles were confident that time would lead Lord Brandon to be the first to take an interest in limiting the White Wolf's influence, and that once peace was achieved, the office would either dissolve or have its powers suspended until needed once more. Thus, through uneasy accord, Jon Stark became the first Marshal of the North, initiating a tenure marked by controversy, light and shadow, and deeds that would shape the Kingdom of the North for centuries to come. Excerpt from Chapter 9 of the book More Than Mere Words, Ranks, Titles, and Offices, Power in the Late Age of the Lords by Maester Petro Hill, written 352 years after the War of the Five Kings. One of the confusions that time has brought is the deterioration of the West AOC people's understanding of the true meaning and impact of the titles, ranks, and offices of the late period. As we defined in the previous chapter, the late period spans nearly 500 years before the end of the War of the Five Kings, but the time that concerns us is that of the last two periods, the Targaryen reign, 0283 after conquest, and the Baratheon transition, 283305 AC, which culminated in what is known as late nobilism, since the system of Aegon I the Conqueror was based on the stratification of the nobility for the governance of the entire continent from a center of power, King's Landing, and whose greatest splendor was reached between the reigns of Jaehaerys I and Aegon IV. Now, within the final period of the Baratheon transition, the famous War of the Five Kings, which would eventually transform into the War of the Three Bastards and later into what some call the War of the Queens, titles, offices, and ranks took on renewed importance. A common case of confusion is the famous Marshal of the North. From our point of view, the title of Marshal of the North, a distinction invested in Jon Stark, may seem to us akin to King in the North and Supreme Commander of the Northern armies, but nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, Marshal of the North is not a title in the traditional sense, it is an office. An office, in the late period sense, is distinguished from a title by the fact that it is not hereditary, is granted by a higher authority, and its powers and legitimacy emanate from that authority. A title, in the late period sense, is hereditary, with limited exceptions considered ceremonial titles, or elective, but restricted to a specific family or group. The difference between the two lies in the rank they conferred and its relationship with the office or title. An office does not confer a permanent rank, beyond the military, and only in very specific cases, and if it is revoked, the loss of the office entails the loss of rank, as occurred with the office of Hand of the King in the time of Aerys II, whereas the loss of a title did not entail the loss of rank. Hence, when a noble was exiled, it was declared that the individual had been stripped of his ranks and titles. Returning to the case of the Marshal of the North, the office in itself grants command in the field over the armies, yet final authority remains vested in the Lord of Winterfell, or in the King, who, in this period and beyond, were one and the same. Nevertheless, the Marshal's civil authority does not derive from the office as such, but from the rank conferred upon its holder by the Lord of Winterfell, namely that of Supreme Commander of the Armies of the North. Thus, while the office bears the designation Marshal of the North, it is the accompanying rank of Supreme Commander that extends the Marshal's authority beyond the battlefield. From this follows that the interpretation that Jon Stark, from his time as Marshal of the North, already acted as King of the North is entirely mistaken. To do so would be to associate royal centralism and the close relationship between the title of King and the office of Marshal of the North, which is the erroneous interpretation many give to the highest military office in the North since its creation. Therefore, it is not surprising that many modern historians, and even later chroniclers, equate the Marshal of the North with royalty, while contemporaries of Jon Stark's time never make this mistake, for committing it is precisely why the controversial move of Howland Reed in what is known as the discussion of Moat Cailin has such a marked political meaning. Modern historians often ignore a crucial distinction: a king rules by right and from life, while a marshal rules by function and temporally. In times of crisis, function eclipses right. When peace returns, the office should have been dissolved or seen its functions reduced, That it did not happen is one of the principal elements taken as marking the end of the late age, as offices were beginning to become more important than titles. Excerpt from Chapter 4 of the book Journeys of Glory, The Independence of the North by Northern historian Brandon Reed. John Stark's first act as Marshal of the North was to convene a formal war council to discuss the strategy for reclaiming the North from the traitors. They knew that the remaining traitors, supported by the Freys, would attack, seeking to capitalize on the consequences of their betrayal and the North's moment of shock. Nevertheless, John Stark pointed out a key element during the meeting. Roose Bolton and his forces were trapped in the Riverlands now that Moat Cailin had been retaken. With Bolton in the south and the road blocked by Moat Cailin, the only real forces capable of threatening Winterfell faced the same problem Robb Stark had once confronted. To compound their difficulties, the newly acquired fleet could effectively block any attempted landing on the North's western coast in the Bay of Salt Spear, while in the east houses Marndale and Locke were more than capable of dealing with any crossing attempt over the Bight, thereby securing the North against any invasion from the south and allowing John Stark to focus on the traitor houses. The White Wolf then devised a plan to destroy the traitors' supporters, thus ensuring that the North could easily defend itself against a southern advance. His strategy was divided into three distinct fronts. The first would be led by himself, commanding 6,000 men in a lightning campaign toward the Rills and the Barrowlands to secure his left flank. The second front would be entrusted to Mage Mormont, who would lead a force of 6,000 men toward the Dread Fort, which had been taken by John Stark during his punitive campaign against Ramsay Snow, and from there launch an assault on Last Hearth and Carhold. The Marshal of the North gave clear orders to attempt negotiations with the boys and castellans governing those castles, proclaiming at the war council, they must be given the opportunity to bend the knee and denounce their fathers as traitors in exchange for retaining their lands and titles. Finally, Howland and Galbart would command 3,000 men with orders to defend Moat Cailin to the last man and to carry out all necessary repairs and improvements to reinforce the defenses of the next fortress. Over the following week, while all marching preparations were being made, Bran and Jon discussed new laws to implement. In the middle of the crisis, John Stark saw an opportunity to consolidate the power of the Starks. The White Wolf knew that in the current power system the Lord Paramount or the kings had limited power. This greatly depended on their ability to rally and keep their bannermen in check. He saw this as an opportunity to centralize power in the king and weaken the position of the lords so that the treason of the Boltons could never happen again. The first law that Jon passed, surprisingly agreed upon with almost no resistance, was that only a Stark family member could be appointed as Marshal. The centralization of military power and command could be explained by the fact that it was common for nobles to be led into battle by their liege lord or by a close relative of his utmost confidence. At first glance, this seemed the same. In reality, it was effectively Jon's first step toward total power, as, without realizing it, the lords had signed away their military independence. The second law, more polemical and more strongly opposed, was the formal incorporation of women into the Northern Army. John Stark encountered heavy resistance at first, but in the end managed to convince the lords by assuring them that only physically fit and willing women would be admitted into the army, that women would be forbidden from serving as line infantry, something universally agreed upon, and that most would serve either as cavalry, light skirmish infantry such as archers, or as non-combatant personnel, thus freeing the male manpower the North desperately needed to rebuild its army. But the most important, and highly polemical, aspect of the reform was the article on Noble Women's Commission. John Stark was well aware that his new army depended on capable middle-ranking officers who could execute his planned maneuvers in order to achieve victories that maximized enemy casualties while minimizing the North's own losses. At present, his regiments had enough officers to operate at almost their highest efficiency, but future regimental officers were an issue. The Red Wedding and the first phase of the War of the Five Kings had already exhausted the pool of northern trained noblemen who could become officers, and the remaining male nobles were either too young and required rigorous training to become competent officers, or too old and in need of learning the new concepts Jon wanted in his command structure. Given this situation, it is clear that Marshal Stark's problem did not lie in the need for soldiers, but for officers. The need for short-term solutions left John Stark with only two viable options. A. Non-noble officers, or B. Female noble officers. The first solution, although more practical and understandable, presented significant downsides. Not every low-born sergeant or lieutenant had the abilities required to become a captain or a direct lieutenant of a colonel, lieutenant colonel. The literacy rate among those ranks was a mere 12%, totally insufficient to meet John's needs, as those positions required the writing of reports, the management of budgets, and the communication of logistical needs through the system Samwell Tarly had created, a system rooted in bureaucracy and written documentation. The White Wolf did not discard this solution, but he knew it was a medium-term approach, and that teaching adults to read and write would take 2 to 3 years, perhaps longer, as the men would have to be taught while on the march. Thus, he had no choice but to consider his second option. Female nobles in the north were highly literate, as the daily management of the household often rested on the ladies, sisters, or female cousins of the lord. Northern culture also helped, as the harsh environment of their homeland meant that northern men expected at least some martial or self-defensive skills from their women. Thus, for John Stark, the only additional requirements were formal tactical training, leadership instruction, and discipline, concepts that could be instilled through intense and rigorous training of both male and female noble officers. To further normalize women's incorporation into the army, John designated Moira to oversee and coordinate the training and raising of this new professional and standardized military force, modeled after John's army reforms during the later stages of the Ironborn campaign, and to supervise the training of the new officers. John was well aware, and made sure everyone else was aware, that this process would take months to complete, and that the only way the North could compete with the numerical superiority of the South was to ensure that these future soldiers were trained to the highest standards and led by the most competent officers the North could produce. For the time being, however, the North could mobilize only 20,000 soldiers, of whom only 15,000 were ready to fight using John's new methods, against more than 100,000 in service to the Iron Throne. The final political discussion of those days concerned the formation of a new fighting force. All men would be recruited in their local towns and undergo 3 months of basic physical training to ensure they were capable of serving as soldiers. They would then march to Winterfell, where they would drill in the new war methods developed by John during the campaign against the Ironborn. These laws, approved in the wake of the Red Wedding, constituted the foundation of John Stark's and the North's army, an army that would serve its marshal with remarkable distinction and revolutionize warfare in Westeros. Yet, as we shall see in the chapters to come, these reforms were neither perfect nor definitive, and John Stark's war machine would continue to evolve. Notes. I hope you enjoyed the reading. Feel free to make any theory you have in the comments. I know that is not the traditional writing style, so please tell me what you think. This is my first work, also English is not my main language. So, if you see any mistakes, please tell me. If you have any constructive criticism or comments, feel free to put it in the comment section. This chapter is different of almost any other on the story, tell me what do you think about it. This chapter was added on the 15th of February, 2026. Chapter 7, The Fratricidal Clash, The Battle of Main Hall. Summary. 10th Moon, 299. The Lannisters and the Iron Throne had wiped out their powerful enemy from the north, King Robb Stark. All of Westeros seemed in suspense as the ambitious Warden of the West, Lord Tywin Lannister, and his allies pushed deeper into the Northern Kingdom and forcing the Starks on the defensive more than anyone since the Andal and Targaryen invaders. But as their armies march northwards, they encounter another formidable opponent, the bastard of Winterfell and vanquisher of the Ironborns, John Stark. The struggle between these two powers would continue to escalate and result in a southern army once more marching against the Gate of the North. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 10th Moon, 299. On the 17th of the 10th moon, John and his force left Moat Cailin for Goldgrass to start the campaign. Having been left without a field assistant, the Marshal searched for a replacement for Moira. John didn't have to wait, and having volunteered himself for the position, his cousin Rickon became it. The following day, Moira and Bran departed alongside the forces of Mirge, who would escort them to Winterfell to start their respective roles. John's advance was swift, and the local population cheered upon the passing of their hero, the one who had masterminded the defeat of the Ironborns and the one who they said would avenge the humiliation and betrayal suffered at the Riverlands. Marching at a quicker pace thanks to good weather, they arrived 4 days later at Goldgrass, the seat of House Stout, a formal vassal of House Dustin, whose lord opens the gates and surrenders without a fight. They inform John of the orders of Lady Barbary to reunite in Barrowton, where the remaining army of the Barrowlands is forming. They also inform him that most of the lesser houses are still loyal to the Starks, and that is only because they fear the retaliation from the Ryswell's armies that they have obliged. This opens a way for Jon to fulfill his objectives, as it is clear that Lady Dustin and Lord Ryswell were also caught unprepared by Lord Bolton's actions. He can march to Barrow Hall and catch the unsuspecting enemy. But he needed a way to get into the castle and capture Lady Dustin. Otherwise, he would most likely end a staggering siege that he had neither the time nor the men to withstand. He also needs to do it because the Ryswell army of the Rills will eventually arrive, so he can defeat them both in detail, thus reducing casualties and ending the campaign right away. Jon also receives a letter from Master Roger Brownborough, Lord of Brown Hall, the frontier castle that guards the road to Barrowton. He offers his assistance and loyalty, as Lady Dustin has been a tyrannical and abusive liege, and he swears that his allegiance is to the Starks of Winterfell. To further prove his loyalty, the Lord sends his sons, Gard and Darin, as a guarantee and makes Jon aware that the common Barrowlander soldier